The old cemetery outside Redemption Creek stood silent in the morning light. Weathered headstones cast long shadows across the frost-covered ground as a solitary figure made his way between the graves. Jackson Blackwood moved with the careful grace of a man who had spent decades in these mountains, his weathered face carved deep with lines of sorrow and time. At 65, his once dark hair had turned silver, but his eyes remained sharp, taking in every detail of his surroundings. He stopped before two simple headstones, smaller than the others. One bore the name Elizabeth Blackwood, the other Michael Blackwood. Jackson knelt slowly, his joints protesting after the long ride from his cabin, and placed a bundle of wildflowers across both graves. Purple lupine and yellow columbine, Elizabeth's favorites. The flowers he had once braided into her hair on summer evenings long ago. "I still see your smile in the sunrise," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. 30 years and it hasn't faded a bit." The crack of a rifle shot shattered the silence. Jackson felt the burn as a bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing through his worn buckskin coat. Decades of survival instinct sent him diving behind a large headstone, hand reaching automatically for a weapon that wasn't there. 30 years Blackwood. The voice echoed across the cemetery, distant but clear. "You can't hide forever." Jackson pressed his back against the cold stone breath, forming clouds in the crisp morning air. Blood seeped through his fingers where he pressed against the wound. Not deep, but enough to remind him he was still mortal. Movement caught his eye, a man in a dark coat stumbling through the trees at the cemetery's edge. Jackson recognized the limp even at this distance. The attacker had fired from too far away, a poor shot from a man whose hands trembled from years of whiskey. The man fell, dropping his rifle. Jackson approached cautiously, picked up the weapon, and stared down at its worn barrel. The weight felt familiar in his hands, too familiar. His finger found the trigger guard, muscle memory from another life. The fallen man looked up, eyes widening with fear beneath the brim of his hat. "Finish it," he rasped. "You've wanted to for 30 years. Jackson studied the rifle, then slowly lowered it. "I swore I wouldn't kill again," he said quietly. "Not even you, Hollister." He placed the weapon on the ground just out of the man's reach. "The past is a ghost we both need to stop chasing." As Jackson turned away, memories flooded back like a dam breaking inside his mind. Not just memories, a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. A life 30 years past. Wyoming Territory, 1848. The sky over the Bighorn Mountains burned crimson as the sun sank behind jagged peaks. Jackson Blackwood stood on the porch of his cabin, watching shadows lengthen across the valley below. At 35, he carried himself like the soldier he had once been, back straight, shoulders squared, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats that rarely came this deep into the wilderness. His cabin perched on a lonely ridge, the last outpost before the wild country began in earnest. He had built it with his own hands 5 years ago, after returning from a war that had taken more than it had given anyone. The rough-hewn logs had weathered to a silvery gray, and the chimney stone had been gathered from the creek that wound through the valley below. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, pushing back against the autumn chill. The cabin was sparse but meticulously organized, a testament to military habits that wouldn't die. A single bed against the wall, a table with a single chair, a trunk containing what few possessions he hadn't burned or buried after Elizabeth and Michael died. On the mantel above the fireplace sat two items that seemed out of place in this warrior's dwelling: a worn Bible, its leather cover cracked with age, and a child's wooden horse carved by Jackson's own hand for his son's 5th birthday. The Bible hadn't been opened in years. The horse collected dust that Jackson couldn't bring himself to wipe away. He turned from the view and went inside, closing the door against the encroaching night. Hanging his rifle on pegs above the door, he moved to the fireplace and stirred the embers with an iron poker. The flames leapt higher, illuminating the small silver cross that hung from a nail beside the mantel, another relic from his former life as a chaplain to the 4th Cavalry. "Not much use for prayers these days," he murmured to the empty room. "Not since you took them both." Thunder rolled across the mountains, distant at first, then growing closer. Jackson looked up, surprised. The sky had been clear at sunset, but mountain weather was fickle. He moved to the window in time to see lightning fork across the suddenly dark sky, illuminating heavy clouds that had gathered with unnatural speed. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then in sheets that lashed against the cabin walls. The wind howled through the pines, bending their tops like bow staves. It would be a long night. Jackson lit a lantern and placed it on the table. From a shelf, he took down a tin plate and a knife. Dinner would be simple jerky beans and the last of the cornbread baked 2 days ago. He ate mechanically without tasting a soldier's habit of fueling the body without concerning the mind. The storm intensified. Rain hammered the roof like fists demanding entry. Lightning flashed continuously, now turning night to day in blinding bursts. Between thunderclaps, Jackson heard something unexpected, a sound out of place in the tempest. A knock at the door, faint, almost imperceptible beneath the storm's fury. Jackson froze, knife in hand. Few people knew of this cabin's existence, and fewer still would brave such a storm to reach it. He set down his plate and moved silently to the rifle above the door, lifting it from its pegs with practiced ease. The knock came again, weaker this time. Not a threat, Jackson realized, someone in distress. Rifle in one hand, he unlatched the door with the other and pulled it open a crack. Wind and rain immediately forced their way inside, but it was what stood illuminated by a flash of lightning that stopped Jackson's breath. A woman barely standing supported herself against the doorframe. Her blonde hair hung in wet ropes around a face pale as death itself. Her dress, once fine by the look of the fabric, was torn and muddied. Blood mingled with rainwater, running in pink rivulets down her arms and neck. "Help!" she whispered the word, nearly lost in the storm's rage. Another lightning flash, and Jackson saw what made his soldier's heart turn cold. As she swayed, the torn back of her dress revealed burned flesh, not random burns, but deliberate. Letters scorched into human skin, Traitor. The woman's eyes blue as mountain gentians found his for just a moment. "They hung me," she whispered. "But the rope, it broke in the storm." Her legs gave way beneath her. Jackson dropped his rifle and caught her before she hit the floor, lifting her easily into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird fallen from its nest. As he carried her to his bed, her head lolled against his chest, consciousness already fled. Laying her gently on the blankets, Jackson worked quickly. He stoked the fire higher, put water to boil, and gathered what few medical supplies he had: alcohol, clean rags, needle and thread. The skills that had once made him valuable to his regiment would serve him again tonight. As he cut away the ruined dress to assess her injuries, a small object fell from a hidden pocket, landing with a metallic clink on the wooden floor. Jackson picked it up, a silver key, ornate and old-fashioned, attached to a leather cord. Alongside it was a folded piece of paper, waterlogged but intact. Unfolding it revealed a partial map, the ink running but still legible, with a location marked in the mountains 20 miles west. Setting these items aside, Jackson continued his work. The woman's wounds told a horrific story: rope burns around her neck, lash marks across her back, and the word traitor burned into her flesh with methodical cruelty. When he gently turned her to clean the burns, something on her shoulder caught his eye. A small tattoo partially hidden beneath her collarbone, a design Jackson knew intimately. A crescent moon encircling a four-pointed star. His hands froze. The room seemed to tilt around him. It was impossible. That mark was unique to his family. Elizabeth had worn it, a small tattoo he had traced with his fingertips on countless nights. Michael had been born with a birthmark of the same shape, what Elizabeth had called heaven's fingerprint, on their son. Yet here it was on this stranger's skin. Jackson's mind raced. Could this woman have known his family, been from the same town back east? Or was this some cruel coincidence, a cosmic joke at his expense? The woman stirred, moaning softly in pain. Questions would have to wait. Jackson returned to his task, cleaning wounds, applying salve to burns, bandaging what he could. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest had begun to brew. Morning came with unsettling clarity. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world washed clean. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in golden beams. Jackson sat in his single chair, positioned between the bed and the door. He hadn't slept. The rifle lay across his lap, not pointed at the woman, but ready nonetheless. Trust was a luxury he had not afforded anyone in years. She still slept, her breathing steadier now. In daylight, with the grime and blood washed away, her features were more defined. High cheekbones, a straight nose, brows that arched naturally. Young, perhaps 25, though suffering had a way of aging a person beyond their years. And beautiful in the way that broken things often are, a reminder of what might have been rather than what is. Jackson rose and moved to the fireplace, adding wood to the rekindled flames. The coffee pot bubbled on its hook, filling the cabin with a rich aroma that masked the lingering smell of blood and medicine. A soft sound from the bed made him turn. The woman's eyes were open alert despite the pain that tightened her features. Those eyes tracked him with wary intelligence, assessing him as thoroughly as he had assessed her. Where she winced, her hand going to her throat where the rope had burned. Wyoming territory, Jackson said, keeping his distance. My cabin. Found you half dead on my doorstep last night. She nodded slightly, a gesture that clearly cost her. Water? Jackson poured a cup from the pitcher by the bed and helped her sit up enough to drink. Her hands trembled, but she managed to hold the cup herself, a small assertion of independence that told him something about her character. Thank you, she whispered after drinking, for everything. Jackson nodded once, then returned to his chair. Who are you? He asked. And who tried to hang you? Pain flickered across her face, but it wasn't physical this time. My name is Catherine Walsh, she said. Most people call me Kate. She paused, seeming to gather strength. As for who tried to hang me, men who work for my father. Jackson kept his expression neutral, but his grip tightened on the rifle. Your father sent men to hang his own daughter. Not directly. Her voice was becoming stronger. He sent them to bring me back. The hanging was their initiative. A message. What kind of message needs burning words on human skin? Kate's hand moved unconsciously to her back, feeling the bandages there. The kind meant to warn others. This is what happens to white women who lie with savages. Bitterness edged her words. That's what they said when they caught me. Jackson's jaw tightened. He knew that particular brand of frontier justice all too well. Your father, he said carefully. Would that be Harrison Walsh, the colonel? Surprise flashed across Kate's face. You know him? By reputation. Jackson's voice betrayed nothing of the rage that surged through him at the name. Harrison Walsh, the man who had ordered the attack on the Apache village, the man whose orders had resulted in Elizabeth and Michael's deaths. He commands Fort Laramie now, I hear. Kate nodded. He's been there 3 years, brought me with him from St. Louis after my mother died. Her gaze dropped to her hands. He wasn't always like this. The frontier changed him. Or maybe it just revealed what was always there. Jackson stood abruptly and moved to the window, needing distance. His mind raced with implications. The daughter of Harrison Walsh in his cabin. The architect of his family's destruction, connected to him by this broken woman who somehow bore his family's mark. Why were you branded a traitor? He asked, his back still to her. Silence stretched between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I fell in love with a man my father considered an enemy, an Apache scout named Running Wolf. Jackson turned slowly. Apache. He worked for the army as a guide. My father trusted him. She smiled sadly. Until he found out about us. Running Wolf was killed trying to protect me when they came for us. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture Jackson wasn't sure he wanted to see. When was this? 3 weeks ago. They kept me at the fort locked away. My father said I was sick with savage fever and needed to be cured. Her hand moved to her stomach in an unconscious gesture that Jackson didn't miss. When he discovered I was carrying Running Wolf's child, he changed, told everyone I had died of fever, planned to send me east on the next supply train. But his men had other ideas. Jackson's gaze sharpened. You're with child. Kate met his eyes defiantly. Yes. The men who took me said they would cut the half-breed from my belly after they were done with me. They strung me up outside a trading post as an example. Her voice broke. The storm came suddenly. Lightning struck a tree nearby. In the confusion, the rope snapped. I ran. For days, I think. I don't remember how I found this place. Jackson turned back to the window, struggling to contain the emotions warring inside him. Walsh's daughter pregnant with an Apache child. The irony might have made him laugh if it weren't so tragic. You need rest, he said finally. Food and time to heal. We'll figure out the rest later. You're not sending me back, Jackson looked at her over his shoulder. I don't work for your father, Miss Walsh. And I don't send injured women back to men who would harm them or their unborn children. Not even for Harrison Walsh. Relief washed over her face. Thank you, Mr. Jackson hesitated only a moment. Blackwood? Jackson Blackwood? The name meant nothing to her, he could see that immediately. Walsh had likely never mentioned the chaplain whose family had died in his unauthorized raid. Why would he? Just more collateral damage in the march of progress. Rest now, Jackson said, moving toward the door. I need to check my traps. Outside in the clean mountain air, Jackson leaned against the cabin wall and closed his eyes. Elizabeth's face rose in his memory, laughing as she hung laundry outside their quarters at Fort Bridger. Michael running circles around her legs, wooden horse clutched in his small hand. What am I supposed to do with this? He whispered to the sky. Is this your idea of justice? Or just another test of faith I'm bound to fail? No answer came except the wind in the pines and the distant cry of an eagle soaring over the valley below. Days passed slowly in the mountain cabin. Kate's strength returned gradually, though the burns on her back would leave scars no matter how carefully Jackson tended them. The rope burn around her neck faded from angry red to a dull purple, a necklace she would wear for the rest of her life. Jackson kept his distance as much as the small cabin would allow. He slept on a bearskin near the fire, giving Kate the bed. During the day, he busied himself with the endless tasks of mountain survival, checking traps, chopping wood, repairing tools. Anything to avoid dwelling on the connection between this woman and the man who had destroyed his life. Kate, for her part, began to help as she was able. She insisted on taking over the cooking, proving surprisingly adept at turning Jackson's simple provisions into satisfying meals. She found wild herbs growing near the cabin and brewed teas that eased pain and promoted healing Apache medicines she had learned from Running Wolf. They spoke little at first, each wrapped in private grief. But isolation has a way of wearing down barriers, and eventually words began to flow more freely between them. You were a soldier, Kate said one evening as they sat before the fire. Not a question. She had seen the precision with which he maintained his weapons, the way he automatically positioned himself with sight lines to all approaches. Jackson nodded. Once, a lifetime ago. What regiment? 4th Cavalry. He poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. I was their chaplain for a time. Kate's eyebrows rose. A man of God. A bitter smile touched Jackson's lips. God and I have had a parting of ways in recent years. Because of the war. Because of what came after. Well, he stood and moved to the mantel, touching the small wooden horse with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. I had a family once. Wife named Elizabeth. Son named Michael. They died in an Apache village. Kate's breath caught. Indians attacked them. No, Jackson's voice hardened. White men did. My wife was a healer. She often visited nearby tribes bringing medicine, helping with difficult births. Our son went with her that day. He stared into the flames. A cavalry unit attacked the village without warning. Elizabeth and Michael were caught in the slaughter. I'm sorry, Kate whispered. Jackson nodded, not trusting himself to speak further. He didn't tell her that it was her father who had given the order, that Harrison Walsh had sent Jackson to the village under the pretense of peace talks only to attack while Jackson was with the chief, that Jackson had run through flames and gunfire searching desperately for his family only to find Elizabeth's body shielding their son beside the river. Both already gone. Some truths were too heavy to speak aloud. My mother died when I was 16, Kate said after a long silence. She was the gentlest soul I've ever known. My father was different when she was alive, kinder, more patient. After she passed, something hardened in him. She twisted a loose thread from her borrowed shirt between her fingers. When we came west, I barely recognized him anymore. Jackson returned to his seat. The frontier changes people. Some find their true selves here. Others lose whatever humanity they brought with them. And you, Kate asked, what did the frontier do to you? Jackson met her gaze across the fire. It showed me that faith without action is meaningless, that prayers don't stop bullets, and that sometimes the only sermon worth preaching is the one you live with your hands and your choices. Kate nodded slowly. Running Wolf said something similar once, that the Creator judges us by the paths we walk, not the words we speak. Her hand moved to her stomach, a gesture that had become habitual. I wonder what path my child will walk, carrying both worlds inside them. A difficult one, Jackson said honestly, but not impossible. I've known men of mixed blood who found their way. The child will have you to guide them. If we survive, Kate said softly, my father won't stop looking. When he sets his mind on something, he's relentless. Jackson's jaw tightened. That at least he knew to be true. We'll cross that river when we come to it. For now, you need to focus on healing and keeping that child healthy. Kate nodded, but her eyes remained troubled as they reflected the dancing flames. Later that night, when Kate had retired to the bed, Jackson removed the silver key and map fragment from the box where he had stored them. The map showed part of the mountain range to the west, with a location marked by an X near what appeared to be a canyon. The key was old, its design intricate, not military issue, but something more refined, perhaps from a strongbox or chest. Jackson studied both items carefully. What was so important about this location? And what did the key open questions that only Kate could answer, but instinct told him to wait? Trust needed to be earned on both sides. He replaced the items in the box and slid it back under a loose floorboard beneath his bearskin. Outside, an owl called into the night 3 times, then silence. Jackson moved to the window, scanning the darkness beyond the glass. Nothing moved except shadows cast by moonlight through swaying branches. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A soldier's instinct that had saved his life more than once. Lord, he whispered, surprising himself with the prayer, if you're still listening to the likes of me, keep us safe this night. Not for my sake, but for hers, and for the child who's done no wrong. The owl called again, closer this time. Jackson checked his rifle, then settled on his bearskin, prepared for a night of watchful waiting. A week passed. Kate's strength grew daily, her body healing with the resilience of youth. The child within her showed no ill effects from her ordeal, a blessing Jackson acknowledged with quiet gratitude. They fell into a routine that felt almost domestic, each finding comfort in the structure of daily tasks. Kate discovered Jackson's small collection of books, mostly practical guides to survival and medicine, but among them a volume of poetry by Wordsworth and a well-worn copy of The Pilgrim's Progress. She read aloud in the evenings, her voice bringing the words to life in the small cabin. Jackson found himself looking forward to these readings, a reminder of evenings with Elizabeth, when they would take turns reading to each other by candlelight. The memory brought pain, but a different kind, now bittersweet rather than raw. One morning, Jackson returned from checking his traps to find Kate sitting on the porch, sewing a tear in one of his shirts. The sight stopped him at the edge of the clearing. Her blonde head bent over her work sunlight, turning her hair to gold, her profile refined against the rough logs of the cabin wall. For a moment, he saw Elizabeth instead, and the pain was sharp enough to take his breath. Then Kate looked up, smiled at him, and the illusion shattered. Successful hunt, she called, nodding toward the pair of rabbits hanging from his belt. Jackson held them up. Stew tonight. Found some wild onions growing by the creek as well. Perfect. I'll add them to the pot with those herbs I dried yesterday. She set aside her sewing and stood carefully, one hand supporting her lower back. The slight swell of her pregnancy was becoming visible now. As Jackson approached, Kate's expression changed, her eyes focusing on something beyond him. He turned, following her gaze to the tree line. A man stood there, leaning heavily against a pine trunk. Blood stained his buckskin shirt, and his face was pale beneath a week's growth of beard. He raised one hand in a gesture that was part greeting, part plea. Help, he called weakly. Shot, ambushed on the trail. Jackson motioned for Kate to go inside, then approached the stranger cautiously, rifle ready, but not aimed. 5 years in these mountains had taught him caution, but he couldn't ignore a man in need. Who are you? Jackson called, stopping 20 paces from the wounded man. Name's Daniel Miller, the man replied, wincing as he shifted his weight. Trapper and guide. 2 men jumped me near Elk Creek. Took my horses, left me for dead. He slumped further against the tree. Been walking 3 days. Jackson closed the distance, scanning the trees beyond Miller for any sign of pursuit or ambush. Finding none, he slung his rifle and supported the wounded man's weight. Let's get you inside. Contend that wound there. Miller nodded gratefully, leaning heavily on Jackson as they made their way to the cabin. Kate stood in the doorway, her expression guarded but concerned. Water's already heated, she said. I'll prepare bandages. Inside, Jackson helped Miller to a chair and cut away the blood-soaked shirt. The wound was a clean shot through the shoulder, missing bone, and major vessels painful but not life-threatening if infection could be prevented. Kate worked alongside Jackson, cleaning the wound with practiced hands while Jackson prepared a poultice of yarrow and pine resin. Miller watched them both through pain-hazed eyes. "Lucky man," he said to Jackson, his voice tight, "having a woman like this in the wilderness." Jackson didn't correct Miller's assumption about their relationship. Better to let the stranger think Kate belonged here, rather than invite questions about who she really was. Kate, however, had gone very still, her eyes fixed on Miller's face. "Have we met before?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Miller looked at her properly for the first time and something flickered across his features. Recognition quickly masked. "Don't believe so, ma'am. I'd remember a face like yours." Kate nodded slowly, but Jackson noticed her hands were no longer steady as she finished bandaging Miller's shoulder. "You need rest," Jackson told Miller. "Can sleep by the fire tonight. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you on your way." "Much obliged," Miller said. "Don't mean to impose, but a man doesn't find much charity in these mountains." His gaze lingered on Kate as she moved away, something in his eyes that Jackson didn't like. That night, after Miller had fallen into an exhausted sleep near the hearth, Kate beckoned Jackson outside. In the silver moonlight, her face was drawn with tension. "I know him," she whispered urgently. "He was one of them, one of the men who took me from the fort. He helped hold me down when they burned me." Jackson's blood went cold. "You're sure?" "Positive. He has a scar on his left hand, a burn mark shaped like a crescent. I saw it when he reached for the water cup." Jackson glanced back at the cabin. "Could be he doesn't recognize you. You were in bad shape when you arrived here." "No," Kate shook her head. "He knows. I saw it in his eyes. He's here for me, Jackson, which means my father can't be far behind." The use of his first name registered dimly through Jackson's racing thoughts. In the week they had spent together, they had maintained a careful formality, Mr. Blackwood, Miss Walsh, as if proper address could somehow contain the growing connection between them. "If he's working for your father, why come alone? Why this charade?" "To confirm I'm here, to scout your defenses." Fear edged her voice. "They'll come at night with enough men to overwhelm you. My father plans meticulously. He doesn't leave things to chance." Jackson nodded slowly. "Then we don't give Miller the chance to report back. In the morning, I'll offer to guide him to the nearest trading post. Lead him in the opposite direction, leave him with enough supplies to survive, but no clear trail back here. And if he refuses," Jackson's expression hardened, "then I'll do what's necessary to protect you and your child. I've buried enough innocence in my lifetime. I won't bury any more." Kate reached out suddenly, her fingers closing around his wrist. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible, "for believing me, for helping me." The touch of her hand sent an unexpected warmth through Jackson's arm. How long had it been since anyone had touched him with something other than commercial purpose? 5 years of solitude had left him unaccustomed to human contact, especially from a woman. "I've seen enough of men like your father to know what they're capable of," he said, gently disengaging from her grip. "Get some sleep. I'll keep watch tonight." Kate nodded and returned to the cabin. Jackson remained outside, scanning the dark forest that surrounded his small clearing. If Miller was a scout, others might already be positioned nearby, watching, waiting. The owl called again 3 times, just as it had every night since Kate's arrival. Jackson frowned. Owls were common in these mountains, but the same call pattern, night after night, that wasn't natural behavior. Moving silently, Jackson circled the cabin's perimeter, staying within the shadows. Near the edge of the trees, he found what he was looking for, the faint impression of a boot print, fresher than the rain-washed ground around it. Someone had stood here watching the cabin. They were being hunted. Dawn broke clear and cold. Jackson had spent the night alternating between keeping watch and checking on Miller, who slept fitfully, occasionally muttering in his fever dreams. Names mostly. Commands. Once he called out Colonel with such urgency that Jackson had to place a hand over his mouth to silence him. Kate rose early, her face showing the strain of a sleepless night. She avoided Miller, staying as far from him as the small cabin would allow, while she prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee. Miller woke as the smell of coffee filled the cabin. He sat up slowly, grimacing, as the movement pulled at his wounded shoulder. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Smell that coffee all the way in my dreams." Jackson handed him a tin cup, strong enough to stand a spoon in it, frontier style. Miller accepted it gratefully, taking a long sip before his gaze settled on Kate, who stood by the fireplace with her back to them. "Your wife's a fine nurse," he said, "hands gentle as any doctor I've known." Jackson didn't correct him. She has a gift for healing. He pushed a bowl of mush toward Miller. Eat, you'll need strength. I'm guiding you to Thompson's trading post today about 10 miles east. They can arrange transport to Fort Laramie if that's where you're headed. A flicker of something disappointment concern crossed Miller's face. Much obliged, but I don't want to be a burden. Point me in the right direction and I'll manage. No burden, Jackson said firmly. Can't, in good conscience, send a wounded man into these mountains alone. Too many ways to die out there. Miller studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're a good Christian Blackwood. Don't find many of those in the wilds. Jackson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Not sure how Christian I am these days. Just doing what needs doing. They set out an hour later, Jackson leading a reluctant Miller toward the East Trail. He had given Kate clear instructions. Bar the door, keep the rifle ready, and if he wasn't back by sundown, take the horse he'd left saddled behind the cabin and ride north to a line shack he maintained for winter hunting. She would be safe there until he could find her. The day warmed as they hiked, Miller keeping pace surprisingly well for a man with a gunshot wound. They spoke little, each measuring the other, in the wedded men accustomed to solitude and suspicion. At midday, they stopped by a small creek to rest and drink. Miller sat heavily on a fallen log, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. Need to rest a spell, he said. Shoulders giving me fits. Jackson nodded and knelt by the creek, filling his canteen. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, creating a gentle music that almost masked the sound of Miller shifting position behind him. Almost, but not quite. Jackson rolled sideways as Miller's knife slashed through the space where his back had been. He came up in a crouch, his own knife already drawn from his boot. Not very Christian of you, Miller, he said, circling to keep the creek at his back. Miller grinned, all pretense of weakness gone. Never claimed to be godly myself. He lunged again, the knife a silver arc in the sunlight. Jackson sidestepped, caught Miller's wrist, and twisted. The knife fell to the ground as Miller grunted in pain. A quick sweep of Jackson's leg sent the man sprawling. Walsh sent you, Jackson said, pressing his knife against Miller's throat. To find his daughter. Fear flickered in Miller's eyes, but he maintained his defiance. Colonel Walsh just wants his daughter back. She's not right in the head, been bewitched by that Apache buck she ran off with. Jackson increased the pressure of the blade, drawing a thin line of blood. She told me what you did to her. The brand, the hanging. She deserved worse, Miller spat. Race traitor, carrying a half-breed bastard that'll be one more problem for decent folk to deal with. Jackson's vision narrowed to a red tunnel rage building in him like a physical force. One push of the knife, and Miller would never hurt anyone again. One moment of violence to prevent future suffering. Elizabeth's face flashed in his mind. Not as he had last seen her, bloody and still, but as she had been in life, gentle, compassionate, believing always in redemption. Jackson exhaled slowly, then removed the knife from Miller's throat. Instead, he brought the hilt down hard against the man's temple. Miller slumped unconscious. Working quickly, Jackson bound Miller's hands and feet with rawhide from his pack. He dragged the unconscious man to a small hollow beneath the creek bank, concealed by overhanging roots and brush. There he secured him, further gagging him with a bandana. You've got water, Jackson told the semi-conscious man. Shelter from the elements. In 3 days, a hunting party from the Shoshone village 2 miles south will pass this way. They'll find you before you starve. He placed Miller's knife just beyond reach of his bound hands. If you're resourceful, you might free yourself sooner. If not, well, consider it penance for what you did to Miss Walsh. Miller's eyes blazed with hatred, but the gag prevented any response. Jackson gathered his belongings and headed west, not back toward his cabin, but on a winding path that would leave no clear trail for anyone following. Only after miles of careful backtracking did he finally turn toward home. The sun was low on the horizon when Jackson approached his cabin from the north, using the cover of trees to survey the clearing before revealing himself. Everything looked undisturbed. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight column, suggesting calm air and no commotion within. Still, caution kept him watching for nearly half an hour before he finally approached the door and knocked 3 short raps, the signal he and Kate had arranged. The door opened immediately. Kate stood there, rifle in hand, relief washing over her face at the sight of him. You're back, she said, stepping aside to let him enter. I was worried. Had a disagreement with our guest, Jackson said, hanging his hat on a peg. He won't be bothering us for a while, but we need to prepare. When he doesn't report back, others will come. Kate nodded, her expression grim. I've been thinking about that. She moved to the table where she had spread out several items, the silver key, the map fragment, and Jackson's copy of the Pilgrim's Progress. I need to tell you what this is about, she said, touching the map. Why my father is so determined to find me beyond just controlling his wayward daughter. Jackson sat across from her, suddenly aware of how weary he felt. The confrontation with Miller, the long journey back, the constant vigilance, all of it weighed on him more than he wanted to admit. I'm listening. Kate took a deep breath. This map shows the location of a gold mine on Apache land. Not just any gold, a vein so rich it could fund an empire. My father and his business partner, Ezra Hollister, discovered it during a survey mission last year. Jackson frowned. If it's on Apache land, they can't legally mine it. Hence the sudden increase in hostile Indian activity reported around Fort Laramie, Kate said bitterly. My father has been manufacturing reasons to break the peace treaties. Each Apache attack, most of them fabricated or provoked, gives him justification to push further into their territory. And Running Wolf discovered this. Kate nodded. He was my father's scout, trusted with information few others had. When he realized what was happening, he gathered evidence, including this map and key, which opens a strongbox containing documentation of the whole scheme. Before he died, he gave them to me. Her voice faltered. He said the truth was the only weapon that could state what was coming. Jackson studied the map fragment. This is why they branded you a traitor. Not just for loving Running Wolf, but for possessing evidence that could destroy your father's plans. Yes, Kate met his gaze steadily. Now you understand what you've involved yourself in by helping me. This isn't just about a father reclaiming his daughter. It's about power, greed, and the fate of entire tribes. Jackson was silent for a long moment, processing everything. The scope of Walsh's treachery was greater than he had imagined, not just the isolated atrocity that had claimed his family, but a systematic campaign of destruction. Where is this strongbox, hidden at a trading post near the canyon marked on the map? Running Wolf trusted the owner, the half-Shoshone man named Joseph Gray Fox. If we can reach it, get the documents to the territorial governor. Walsh would be finished, Jackson finished, along with Hollister and anyone else involved. Kate nodded, but first we have to survive long enough to get there. Jackson stood and moved to the window, scanning the darkening forest. We leave at first light, pack only what's essential. We'll take the north trail, then cut west once we're clear of the likely search routes. Thank you, Kate said softly. I know what I'm asking of you, to risk your life for a cause that isn't yours. Jackson turned to face her, his expression somber. Justice is everyone's cause, Miss Walsh, and I've been hiding from mine too long. As darkness fell, they prepared for the journey ahead. Jackson cleaned his rifle and hunting knife, checked their supplies, and laid out the route they would follow. Kate packed medicines, food, and the few personal items she had accumulated during her stay. Neither spoke of the growing tension between them, a connection that transcended their shared circumstances. In the small confines of the cabin, they moved around each other with an awareness that both acknowledged and denied their mutual attraction. Later, as Kate slept on the bed and Jackson kept watch by the window, he found himself reaching for the Bible on the mantel. The leather cover was starved from disuse, the pages musty with neglect. He opened it randomly and his eyes fell on a passage from Isaiah. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Words he had once preached with conviction before grief and anger had clouded his faith. Now they seemed to speak directly to his situation, to Kate carrying a fatherless child, to the Apache people oppressed by men like Walsh, to his own dormant sense of justice awakening after years of hibernation. Is this why you sent her to me? He whispered, his finger tracing the faded text. To remind me of who I was, or to show me who I still could be. Outside, the owl called 3 times. Jackson closed the Bible and returned to his vigil, rifle across his knees, as the mountain night deepened around the small cabin and its unlikely inhabitants. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when the first shot splintered the cabin window. Jackson was on his feet instantly, pulling Kate from the bed to the floor as glass shattered across the room. Stay down, he commanded, crawling to retrieve his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. More shots followed, peppering the cabin walls. From the sound, Jackson counted at least 3 shooters positioned around the clearing. Miller, Kate asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaos. No, Jackson replied grimly. Not enough time for him to free himself and return with reinforcements. These must be the men already watching the cabin, the ones he was supposed to signal. He reached the window and carefully peered over the sill. In the pre-dawn gloom, he could make out shadowy figures moving at the edge of the trees. More disciplined than simple bandits, they maintained cover and fired in coordinated bursts, one group shooting while the others reloaded. Military tactics. Your father's men, Jackson said. Regular soldiers or hired guns. Could be either, Kate replied, staying low as she moved to the fireplace. My father has both at his disposal. Jackson fired through the broken window, aiming not to hit, but to force the attackers back into deeper cover. We need to reach the horses. The cabin won't hold against a determined assault. Kate nodded, already gathering their packed supplies. The back door. Too exposed. They'll have it covered. Jackson reloaded quickly. There's a cellar trap door under the bearskin. It leads to a tunnel I dug my first winter here, comes out in a ravine about 100 yards east. Kate's eyebrows rose in surprise. You built an escape tunnel? A grim smile touched Jackson's lips. Army chaplain who spent 3 years in Confederate prison camps. I don't believe in leaving things to chance. He fired again, then moved to the center of the room and rolled back the bearskin, revealing a trapdoor set into the floorboards. Go, I'll cover, then follow. Kate hesitated. Jackson? Go, he urged more forcefully. I'll be right behind you. With one last look, Kate descended through the trapdoor, their supplies slung over her shoulder. Jackson replaced the bearskin, then moved back to the window. The attackers were growing bolder, advancing closer to the cabin under the cover of their companions' fire. Jackson fired methodically, keeping them at bay without wasting ammunition. Then, when he judged Kate had enough of a head start, he retreated to the trapdoor and slipped into the darkness below. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing Jackson to crouch as he made his way along its length. Roots dangled from the dirt ceiling, and the air was thick with the smell of earth and confinement. His hands found the walls by memory, guiding him through the blackness toward the distant pinprick of light that marked the exit. Kate waited for him, there crouched in the shallow ravine where the tunnel emerged. She had already untied the horses Jackson kept hidden nearby, a precaution born of the same instinct that had led him to dig the tunnel. They haven't discovered we're gone yet, she whispered as he emerged. But they will soon. Jackson nodded, helping her mount before swinging into his own saddle. We ride north until we hit Pine Creek, then follow it west. The water will hide our trail. They set off at a gallop, keeping to the ravine until it widened into a small valley. Behind them, gunfire still peppered the cabin, but it wouldn't be long before the attackers realized their quarry had escaped. As they rode, the sun crested the eastern mountains, bathing the landscape in golden light. Any other day, Jackson might have paused to appreciate the beauty of dawn in the high country. Today, he kept his focus on the trail ahead and the precious cargo he was escorting to safety. Kate rode well for a city-raised woman, handling her mount with confidence despite her condition. The horse was Jackson's spare, an older gelding with a gentle disposition, chosen specifically for its steady gait and calm temperament. She had named him Patience, which seemed fitting for an animal whose greatest virtue was endurance. They reached Pine Creek by mid-morning and paused to water the horses and rest briefly. Kate dismounted carefully, one hand supporting her lower back as she stretched. Are you all right? Jackson asked, concern evident in his voice. The ride isn't too much. Kate shook her head. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Blackwood. This child is half Apache. They're born to the saddle. Jackson smiled despite himself. Jackson, he said, if we're running for our lives together, you might as well use my given name. A flush touched Kate's cheeks. Jackson, she repeated softly. It suits you. The moment hung between them, fragile and significant. Then Jackson turned away, refocusing on their immediate needs. We should reach the trading post by nightfall if we maintain this pace, he said, studying the map Kate had brought. But we'll need to be cautious. Word travels fast in these parts, and Walsh's men could be anywhere. Kate nodded, her expression sobering. If anything happens to me, promise you'll get the documents to the governor. The truth needs to come out, even if I don't live to see it. Jackson looked at her sharply. Nothing's going to happen to you, not while I'm breathing. You can't guarantee that, Kate said gently. We both know the odds we're facing. Jackson approached her, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. I've buried enough people I cared about, Kate. I won't bury you too. The admission hung in the air between them, unexpected and unplanned. Kate's eyes widened slightly and her lips parted as if to speak. Before she could, Jackson turned away and began checking the horse's tack with unnecessary thoroughness. They rode on in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, as the creek led them westward toward the canyon where their futures would be decided one way or another. By late afternoon, the terrain had changed, becoming more rugged as they approached the foothills of the western range. The creek narrowed, running faster over rocks and small falls. Eventually, they were forced to leave its cover and strike out across open country. How much farther? Kate asked as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Jackson pointed to a line of darker trees ahead. The trading post is just beyond that ridge, another hour, maybe less. Kate nodded, her face showing the strain of the long ride despite her earlier bravado. Jackson knew she would never complain, but he could see the toll the journey was taking on her still healing body. We'll rest here a while, he said, guiding his horse toward a small copse of pines that offered some shelter. No sense arriving exhausted. They dismounted in the shade of the trees. Jackson helped Kate down, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. She smiled up at him gratefully, and something shifted in Jackson's chest, a loosening of the tight band that had constricted his heart for 5 long years. As Kate settled against a tree trunk, Jackson stood watch at the edge of their small sanctuary, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. The land stretched empty in all directions, painted in the gold and purple hues of approaching sunset. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, perhaps. A flicker of movement caught Jackson's eye, a distant rider cresting a hill to the east. Then another, and another. Kate, he said quietly, we need to go. Now. Kate followed Jackson's gaze to the distant horizon where riders materialized like specters against the setting sun. Without a word, she rose and moved to her horse, ignoring the protest of tired muscles and the dull ache in her back. How many? She asked, her voice steady as Jackson helped her mount. 6, maybe 7, he replied, swinging into his own saddle. Too many to fight, too many to be coincidence. They set off at a gallop, abandoning stealth for speed. The trading post was their only hope now, a sanctuary where they might find allies or at least walls behind which to make a stand. The thunder of hooves behind them grew steadily louder as they raced across the open grassland. Jackson led them on a zigzagging course, using what little cover the terrain provided, shallow gully stands of aspen rock formations that rose like monuments from the prairie floor. There, Kate pointed to a cluster of log buildings nestled in a protected valley ahead. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and horses stood in a corral beside the largest structure, the trading post. They had almost reached it when a rifle shot cracked the air. Kate's horse screamed and stumbled, throwing her forward over its neck. Jackson wheeled his mount around, watching in horror as Kate and her horse went down in a tangle of limbs and dust. He was beside her instantly, leaping from his saddle to kneel at her side. Kate lay still, her face pale against the darkening ground. For one terrible moment, Jackson thought she was dead. Then her eyes fluttered open, dazed but aware. Can you move? He asked urgently, glancing over his shoulder at the approaching riders. Kate nodded, grimacing as she tried to stand. The baby. Don't think about that now, just move. Jackson helped her to her feet, noting with relief that the blood on her skirt was from a scrape on her leg, not something worse. He boosted her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. The horse protested the double burden, but responded to Jackson's urging, carrying them the final distance to the trading post. As they approached, a man appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand. State your business, he called, raising the weapon. Sanctuary, Jackson replied. Woman injured, men in pursuit. The man hesitated only briefly before lowering his rifle and gesturing them inside. Get in quick. They dismounted Jackson, supporting Kate as they hurried into the trading post. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow over rough-hewn counters, stacked with goods, furs, tools, sacks of flour and coffee ammunition, and the sundry items that sustained life on the frontier. The man who had admitted them was tall and lean, with features that spoke of mixed heritage, the high cheekbones and copper skin of his native mother, the beard and blue eyes of his white father. He barred the door behind them, then turned to assess the situation. Joseph Gray Fox, Kate asked, her voice weak but determined. The man's eyes narrowed. Who's asking? I'm Catherine Walsh. Running Wolf sent me. Recognition and sorrow passed across Gray Fox's face. He said you might come. Said to watch for a white woman carrying his child. His gaze dropped to her midsection, then returned to her face. I heard what happened to him. I'm sorry. There's no time, Kate said urgently. The strong box is its safe. Gray Fox nodded, hidden where no one would think to look. He glanced at Jackson. And this man, Jackson Blackwood, Kate replied. He saved my life. He's trustworthy. Gray Fox studied Jackson for a moment and then nodded. The men following you, Army. Some, Jackson confirmed. Others look like hired guns, 7 by my count. 8, Gray Fox corrected, peering through a gap in the window shutters. They're forming a perimeter. Jackson helped Kate to a chair near the fireplace. We need to get those documents and find a way out. Gray Fox shook his head. No way out now except through them. Best prepare for a siege. He moved to a trapdoor behind the counter and lifted it. But first, let's get what you came for. He descended into the cellar and returned moments later with a small iron box ornately crafted, but showing signs of age. Kate removed the silver key from around her neck and handed it to Gray Fox, who inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a solid click. Inside lay a stack of papers, maps, letters, and official-looking documents bearing military seals. Gray Fox spread them on the counter. Running Wolf gathered these over months, he explained. Orders for unauthorized raids, reports of fictional Apache attacks, correspondence between Colonel Walsh and mining interests back east. He tapped a map similar to the fragment Kate possessed. And this, the true prize, detailed surveys of gold deposits on Apache land. Jackson examined the documents, a cold fury building in his chest as he recognized Walsh's signature on orders identical to those that had led to the death of his family. It hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic campaign. These are enough to hang him, Jackson said quietly. If we live to deliver them, Kate replied. A voice called from outside, cutting through the gathering dusk. Catherine, I know you're in there. Come out now, and no one needs to get hurt. Kate froze, her face draining of color. My father, she whispered. Jackson moved to the window, carefully peering through a crack in the shutters. Colonel Harrison Walsh sat astride a large bay horse at the center of the assembled men. Even at this distance, the family resemblance was clear, the same straight nose and determined chin that Kate possessed, though his features were hardened by years of command and the pursuit of power. Miss Walsh is under my protection, Gray Fox called back. This is neutral territory, Colonel. You have no authority here. Walsh's laugh was cold. I have 7 armed men who say otherwise. Send out my daughter and whatever documents she stole, and you can continue your business uninterrupted. And if we refuse, Gray Fox challenged, then we burn this place to the ground with all of you inside. Walsh replied matter-of-factly. Your choice. Gray Fox turned to Kate. What do you want to do? Kate stood, one hand pressed against her stomach, as if to protect the child within. I won't surrender. Not to him. Not after everything he's done. Jackson nodded, admiring her courage even as he calculated their slim chances. How well is this place stocked for defense? 3 rifles, 2 pistols, ammunition for all, Gray Fox replied. Food and water for a week if it comes to that. But there are 8 of them and 3 of us. 4, came a voice from the back room. A young Shoshone woman stepped into the light, a Winchester repeating rifle held confidently in her hands. I can shoot as well as any man. Gray Fox's expression softened. My wife, Morning Star. Jackson acknowledged her with a respectful nod. 4 against 8. Still poor odds. Worse than you think, Gray Fox said grimly. I recognize some of those men. Former Army scouts, trackers. They won't give up easily. Outside, Walsh's patience was wearing thin. You have until dawn to make your decision, he called. After that, we come in shooting. Silence fell as the colonel and his men withdrew to establish camp just beyond rifle range. Inside the trading post, the 4 defenders gathered around the fireplace to plan their strategy. There's a back exit, Gray Fox explained, sketching a rough map on the counter. Hidden beneath the storeroom, leads to a ravine about a quarter-mile west. But they'll have that area watched. What about creating diversion, Morningstar suggested. Draw their attention to one side while someone escapes from the other. Jackson considered this. Possible, but whoever creates the diversion would likely be sacrificing themselves. Kate shook her head. No, I won't have anyone else die for me. There must be another way. They fell silent, each lost in thought as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the rough walls. Finally, Jackson spoke. The documents are what matter. If we can get them to the territorial, Governor Walsh and his schemes are finished, regardless of what happens to any of us. Kate looked at him sharply. What are you suggesting? I'll take the documents tonight, slip out through the back. Make for Fort Bridger, where the governor is scheduled to review the troops next week. Alone, Kate's voice rose. That's suicide. Less chance of being spotted, Jackson countered, and I know these mountains better than Walsh's men. Gray Fox nodded slowly. It could work, but what about Miss Walsh? The colonel won't stop hunting her. I'll stay, Kate said firmly. Create the impression that the documents are still here. Buy Jackson time to reach Fort Bridger. No, Jackson's response was immediate and forceful. I won't leave you to face your father alone. Kate rose and approached him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. You said yourself the documents are what matter. This isn't just about me anymore or even my child. It's about justice for Running Wolf's people, for your family, for everyone Walsh has hurt in his quest for power and gold. Jackson wanted to argue, but the logic was undeniable. Still, something in him rebelled at the thought of abandoning her, this woman who had somehow breached the walls around his heart in the span of mere weeks. There's something you should know, he said quietly, drawing her away from the others. Something I haven't told you. Kate studied his face, concern evident in her expression. What is it? Jackson took a deep breath. The Apache village where my family died, it was attacked under your father's orders. The same campaign you've uncovered. Elizabeth and Michael were victims of his gold fever, just like Running Wolf. Kate's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with shock and horror. No, she whispered. Oh God, no. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you with it, Jackson continued. It wasn't your fault. But now you understand why I can't leave you here. Why this is personal for me too. Tears welled in Kate's eyes, but her voice remained steady. All the more reason for you to take these documents. For Elizabeth, for Michael, for everyone who can't speak for themselves anymore. Before Jackson could respond, Gray Fox approached with a bundle of papers. I've copied the most damning evidence, he said. Enough to prove Walsh's crimes without risking the originals. If you're captured, they'll seem authentic enough. Jackson accepted the bundle, conflicted, but seeing the wisdom in their plan. And the originals? We'll hide them here, Gray Fox replied. If you make it through, fine. If not, we'll find another way. Morningstar joined them carrying supplies. Food, water, ammunition, she said, handing Jackson a small pack. And this. She pressed a leather pouch into his hand. Medicine, for strength and clear vision when the path is dark. Jackson nodded his thanks, touched by the gesture. As the others moved away to make final preparations, he turned back to Kate. I'll come back for you, he promised, as soon as the documents are delivered. Kate managed a smile through her tears. I know you will. In the privacy of Gray Fox's back room, they shared a moment of quiet connection. Jackson found himself memorizing her face, the gentle curve of her jaw, the determination in her blue eyes, the strength that radiated from her, despite everything she had endured. There's something else, Kate said softly, something about Running Wolf. Jackson waited, sensing the importance of what she was about to reveal. He had a birthmark, she continued. Here, she touched her collarbone, a crescent moon encircling a four-pointed star. He said it was a sign from his ancestors, marking him as a bridge between worlds. Jackson's breath caught. The same mark that had been on Michael's skin. The same design tattooed on Elizabeth's shoulder. The same symbol he had seen on Kate when he first tended her wounds. That's not possible, he whispered. He was found as a child by an Apache family after a raid on their village. Kate continued, raised as one of their own, but always knew he was different. He was searching for his birth family when he joined the army as a scout. The implications crashed over Jackson like a wave. Could Running Wolf have been Michael? His son grown to manhood only to die never knowing his true father lived just miles away. How old was he? Jackson asked, his voice barely audible. 23, Kate replied. Born during the early years of the war as best he knew. The timing matched. Michael would have been 23 this year, But it was impossible. Jackson had seen his son's body, held him in his arms as life fled. Hadn't he? The memory was fragmented, clouded by smoke and grief. Elizabeth lying beside the river, her body shielding a smaller form. Jackson had assumed it was Michael had buried what he believed were his son's remains beside his wife. But what if he had been wrong? What if in the chaos of the attack, Elizabeth had entrusted their son to an Apache family before returning to help others? What if the child Jackson buried was another victim, similar in size to his 5-year-old boy? "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, his mind reeling. Kate's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I didn't make the connection until I saw the photograph in your cabin, the one with your wife and son. The birthmark was visible on your son's shoulder. But I couldn't be certain, and I couldn't bear to give you hope that might prove false." Jackson turned away, overwhelming emotion, threatening to break through his carefully maintained composure. If Running Wolf had been Michael, then the child Kate carried was his grandchild, the last living piece of his family. The responsibility settled on him with new weight. He had to survive, had to ensure the documents reached their destination, had to return for Kate and the child she carried. "I'll come back," he repeated, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I swear it." Kate nodded, unable to speak. Instead, she reached up and touched his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered cheek. Jackson caught her hand and held it for a moment, allowing himself this small connection before the dangers that lay ahead. Outside, the night had deepened. Through the cracks in the shutters, they could see the glow of Walsh's campfire as a reminder of the enemy that awaited them. Gray Fox approached, his expression solemn. "It's time. The moon has set and the night is at its darkest. If you're going to slip past them, it must be now." Jackson nodded, gathering the pack Morningstar had prepared. The copied documents were secure inside his coat, close to his body, where they would remain dry even if he had to ford streams or endure rain. Final preparations were made in silence. Gray Fox checked the hidden exit beneath the storeroom floor, ensuring the tunnel beyond was clear. Morningstar distributed ammunition and positioned weapons near the windows for the defense that would inevitably come at dawn. Kate stood apart, her face composed despite the turmoil Jackson knew she must be feeling. When the time came for his departure, she approached and pressed something into his hand, a small wooden carving of a horse. "I found it in your cabin," she explained. "It seemed important to you, a talisman for your journey." Jackson stared at the toy he had carved for Michael's 5th birthday, the last gift his son had received before the raid. That Kate had thought to bring it, had recognized its significance, without being told, touched him deeply. "Thank you," he said simply, tucking the small horse into his shirt pocket next to his heart. With final nods to Gray Fox and Morningstar, Jackson descended into the tunnel beneath the storeroom. Kate's whispered Godspeed, following him into the darkness. The tunnel was narrow and low, forcing him to crouch as he moved through the damp earth. The air was heavy with the scent of soil and roots, and complete darkness enveloped him once the trapdoor closed above. Moving by touch alone, Jackson followed the passage as it curved westward, eventually emerging in a ravine just as Gray Fox had described. The night air was crisp with the promise of frost by morning. Jackson paused, allowing his eyes to adjust to the starlight, while he listened for any sound that might betray the presence of Walsh's men. Hearing nothing, he began to move quietly up the ravine, keeping to the shadows of the rock walls. His plan was simple but dangerous: circle wide around the trading post, retrieve his horse from where Gray Fox's young assistant had hidden it, then make for Fort Bridger at top speed. If all went well, he could cover substantial ground before Walsh realized he was gone. The terrain was familiar to Jackson. He had hunted these slopes in years past, knew the game. Trails and water sources, the places where a man could move unseen, and those where exposure was inevitable. This knowledge was his greatest advantage over Walsh's men, most of whom would be accustomed to the open prairie around Fort Laramie, rather than the rugged foothills of the Western Range. He had traveled perhaps a mile when a sound froze him in mid-step, the soft nicker of a horse close by. Dropping to a crouch, Jackson scanned his surroundings. There, in a small clearing to his right, a figure sat motionless on horseback, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. A sentry. Walsh had been more thorough than anticipated, positioning men to watch the ravine, despite its hidden nature. Jackson weighed his options. To retreat meant failure before his mission had properly begun. To proceed meant almost certain discovery. To remain in place invited eventual detection as dawn approached. The decision was made for him when the sentry's horse caught his scent and whinnied softly. The rider immediately tensed, scanning the darkness where Jackson hid among the juniper bushes. "Who's there?" the man called, his hand moving to the rifle in his saddle holster. Jackson remained motionless, barely breathing as the rider dismounted and advanced cautiously, rifle now in hand. The man was perhaps 20 paces away, moving slowly, his attention focused on the area where Jackson concealed himself. 15 paces. 10. The distance closing with each careful step. When the sentry was just 5 paces away, a rock clattered down the slope to Jackson's left, a small avalanche triggered by some nocturnal creature. The man turned toward the sound, momentarily distracted. Jackson seized the opportunity. Rising from his hiding place, he closed the distance in 3 silent strides and brought the butt of his hunting knife down hard on the back of the sentry's head. The man collapsed without a sound, unconscious before he hit the ground. Working quickly, Jackson bound and gagged the unconscious man with strips torn from his own bandana. He dragged the sentry beneath a rocky overhang where he would be hidden from casual observation, then claimed the man's horse, a sturdy bay gelding with army markings on its saddle. Leading the horse well away from the area before mounting, Jackson set off toward the north, away from both the trading post and his original planned route. Only after riding for nearly an hour did he turn west, making for the mountain passes that would eventually lead to Fort Bridger. The night passed in a blur of starlight and shadow, the rhythm of the horse's hooves beneath him, the only constant in a landscape that shifted from prairie to foothills to the beginnings of true mountain terrain. Jackson pushed on without rest, knowing that time was his most precious commodity. Dawn found him high in the mountains, following a game trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. Below, mist filled the valleys like ethereal lakes, concealing the world he had left behind. Above, the first rays of sunlight gilded distant peaks with gold and rose. It was in this moment of fragile beauty that Jackson allowed himself to truly contemplate what Kate had told him about Running Wolf. Could the Apache warrior truly have been his son? The coincidence seemed too great, the birthmark too specific to be chance. Yet the idea that Michael had lived, had grown to manhood without knowing his true father, only to die at the hands of the same forces that had separated them. Originally, it was almost too cruel to bear. And if Running Wolf had been Michael, then the child Kate carried was indeed his grandchild, the last living branch of his family tree, carrying both his blood and that of the Apache people his wife had so respected. The irony was not lost on Jackson. He who had once preached God's divine plan from pulpits and around campfires now found himself questioning what kind of plan could include such pain, such loss, and such unexpected connection. He rode on the mountains, rising around him like silent witnesses to his journey. By midday, he had reached a high pass where the trail narrowed between towering rock walls. Beyond lay the western slopes and eventually Fort Bridger with its promise of justice. Jackson paused to rest the horse and take a small meal of jerky and hardtack from his pack. As he ate, he studied the surrounding terrain, an old soldier's habit that had saved his life more than once. The pass was a natural choke point, ideal for an ambush. Yet it was also the most direct route west, saving hours compared to the longer, more gradual paths to the north and south. Time versus safety, the eternal calculus of the frontier. Decision made, Jackson remounted and urged the bay forward into the pass. The horse's hooves echoed against the stone walls, each step amplified in the narrow space. Jackson kept his rifle across his lap, ready, his eyes constantly scanning the rocks above for any sign of movement. Halfway through the pass, the trail curved sharply around a massive boulder. As Jackson rounded the bend, his instincts screamed a warning. He reined in sharply, but it was too late. Across the trail, not 30 paces ahead, 3 riders sat waiting, rifles leveled at his chest. "That's far enough, Blackwood," called the central figure, a man whose weathered face and cold eyes Jackson recognized instantly, despite the years that had passed since their last meeting. "Hollister," Jackson acknowledged, keeping his voice level, despite the surge of adrenaline. "Long way from Dustwater." Ezra Hollister, Walsh's business partner and fellow Hawaii architect of the Apache displacement, smiled without warmth. "Business takes me all over these days. Profitable business, until you and Walsh's wayward daughter decided to interfere." "How did you know I'd come this way?" Jackson asked, mind racing through possible escape routes, even as he kept the conversation going. Hollister shrugged. "Walsh has his plans. I have mine. I figured you'd make for Fort Bridger with whatever evidence the girl collected. This pass is the most direct route." He gestured with his rifle. Now I'll take those documents you're carrying. Jackson remained motionless, weighing his options. To surrender the documents meant failure. Walsh would continue his campaign unchecked. More Apache would die, and Kate's sacrifice would be in vain. To resist meant likely death here in this remote pass with no witnesses except the indifferent mountains. There's no way out, Blackwood, Hollister continued. Hand over the papers, and maybe I let you ride away. Fight and you die here. Simple as that. Jackson's hand tightened on his rifle. Nothing's ever that simple, Hollister. What happened next occurred with the sudden violence that characterized life on the frontier. As Jackson raised his rifle, a shot rang out from the rocks above, not aimed at him, but at Hollister's men. One toppled from his saddle with a cry of surprise and pain. The others wheeled their mounts searching for this new threat. Jackson didn't hesitate. He fired at Hollister, the bullet striking the man's shoulder and spinning him half out of his saddle. Then he spurred his horse forward, charging through the momentary gap in the ambush line, as more shots echoed from the rocks above. Hooves pounding, Jackson raced through the remainder of the pass and onto the open slope beyond. Behind him, shouted curses, and the crack of rifle fire faded as distance grew between him and his pursuers. Only when he reached the shelter of a pine forest 2 miles beyond did he slow his mount and look back. No one followed, at least not immediately. But who had fired from the rocks? Who had intervened at that crucial moment? The answer came as a rider emerged from the trees to his left, a Shoshone man on a paint pony, rifle still in hand. "Gray Fox sent us," the man explained in careful English. "Said you might need help. Good thing we came." Jackson nodded his gratitude. Hollister, alive but wounded. His men took him back toward the trading post. And the others, Gray Fox, the women. The Shoshone's expression darkened. Fighting began at dawn. The colonel's men attacked the post. We don't know who lives or dies. Some of our people went to help, but we were sent to find you. Jackson's chest tightened with fear for Kate and the others. I need to go back. No, the Shoshone said firmly. Gray Fox was clear. The papers must reach Fort Bridger. We will escort you there. Other warriors have gone to the trading post. What happens there is in the Creator's hands now. Though every instinct urged him to return to Kate's side, Jackson knew the Shoshone spoke truth. The documents were the priority, the evidence that could end Walsh's reign of terror once and for all. How many days to Fort Bridger, he asked. 2 if we ride hard, less if we take the high passes, but that is dangerous with snow coming. Jackson glanced at the sky where dark clouds were indeed gathering over the western peaks. Early snow was not uncommon in these mountains, even in autumn. It would slow their journey perhaps fatally if they were caught in a serious storm. We ride for the high passes, he decided. Time matters more than comfort now. The Shoshone nodded, respect evident in his dark eyes. I am called Swift Arrow, he said. My brothers High Wolf and Running Elk are nearby watching the back trail. We will keep you safe until Fort Bridger. Jackson extended his hand, which Swift Arrow clasped in the white man's custom. I owe you my life, Jackson said, and possibly the lives of many others if we succeed. Swift Arrow shrugged. We fight for our land, same as you. The colonel and his gold seekers threaten all who live in these mountains, not just Apache. With that pragmatic assessment, Swift Arrow whistled softly. 2 more Shoshone riders emerged from the trees, rifles ready, eyes constantly scanning for danger. Together, the small party set off toward the higher trails, racing against both pursuing enemies and the approaching storm. The day passed in a blur of increasing elevation and deteriorating weather. By late afternoon, snow began to fall gently at first, then with increasing intensity as the storm system moved in from the west. Temperature dropped rapidly and wind rose to whip the snowflakes into horizontal streaks that stung exposed skin and reduced visibility to mere yards. The Shoshone guides pressed on with unerring confidence, following trails invisible to Jackson's eyes. Their knowledge of the mountain geography was intimate and precise: where to find shelter, which slopes to avoid due to avalanche risk, how to navigate by landmarks mostly obscured by the storm. As darkness fell, Swift Arrow led them to a small cave set into a cliff face sheltered from the worst of the wind. Inside, they found dry wood stacked against the wall, evidence that the Shoshone used this place regularly in their travels. We stay here tonight, Swift Arrow announced. Storm too strong for safe travel. Continue at first light. Though Jackson chafed at the delay, He recognized the wisdom in the decision. Trying to navigate the high passes in a blizzard at night was suicide regardless of the urgency of their mission. The four men established camp efficiently, building a small fire near the cave mouth where the smoke could escape without filling their shelter. The horses were brought inside and positioned at the rear of the cave, their body heat providing additional warmth in the confined space. As they shared a simple meal of jerky, dried berries, and pinole, Jackson studied his companions. All three Shoshone were young, perhaps in their early 20s, but carried themselves with the quiet confidence of experienced warriors. Their rifles were well maintained, and each wore a mix of traditional clothing and items acquired through trade, with whites, wool blankets, cotton shirts beneath buckskin vests, cavalry boots beneath fringed leggings. "You know Gray Fox well?" Jackson asked as they huddled near the fire. Swift Arrow nodded. "He is married to our cousin, a good man who treats her with respect. Unusual for a half-breed in these times." The term was stated without malice, simply a factual description in a world where bloodlines often determined one's place in treatment. "And you trust him," Jackson continued, "enough to ride into danger on his word." "Gray Fox does not lie." High Wolf responded, speaking for the first time. His English was more accented than Swift Arrow's, but clear. "He said you carry proof of the Colonel's crimes, proof that might stop the killing of our Apache brothers. That is worth riding for." Running Elk, the youngest of the three, added something in Shoshone. Swift Arrow translated, "He says his sister's husband was killed in one of the Colonel's raids last summer, a raid that never happened according to the Army, but left 20 dead nonetheless." Jackson nodded grimly. The pattern was clear: fabricated attacks justifying retaliatory strikes, all in service of clearing Apache from lands that contained gold. How many had died for Walsh and Hollister's greed? How many families torn apart like his own? "We will get you to Fort Bridger," Swift Arrow promised, "even if the storm continues, even if the Colonel's men follow. This is our sacred duty now." Jackson extended his hands toward the fire-warming fingers stiffened by cold and the long day's ride. "And what of the trading post, Gray Fox, the women?" Swift Arrow's expression revealed nothing. "Other warriors went there. Good fighters. If they arrived in time, perhaps your friends still live." It was small comfort, but the only kind available in their current circumstances. Jackson thought of Kate, her courage, her determination to see justice done despite the personal cost. He prayed she had survived the attack, that she and her unborn child were safe, the child who might be his grandchild, the last living link to Michael if Running Wolf had indeed been his son. From his shirt pocket, Jackson removed the small wooden horse Kate had given him before his departure. In the flickering firelight, the simple carving seemed to come alive, its lines flowing with a grace that belied its rough creation. He had carved it for Michael's birthday, working on it during evening hours as after his chaplain duties were complete, the wood taking shape beneath his knife as he imagined his son's delight. Now it served as both talisman and reminder of all that had been lost and all that might yet be saved. Swift Arrow watched him with curious eyes. "Medicine object?" he asked. Jackson smiled faintly. "Of a sort, a reminder of why I'm making this journey." When the Shoshone nodded, understanding the concept of objects that carried power beyond their physical form. From around his neck, he removed a small leather pouch and opened it, extracting a polished stone shot through with veins of red. "My medicine," he explained, "found on the day of my first vision quest. It speaks to me sometimes in dreams, tells me which path to follow when the way is unclear." He offered the stone to Jackson, who accepted it respectfully, feeling its smooth weight in his palm. There was nothing obviously special about it, just a river stone with interesting coloration. Yet Swift Arrow treasured it as a connection to the spiritual world that guided his people's lives. Jackson returned the stone with a nod of appreciation for the sharing of something so personal. In that moment, he felt the distance between their worlds narrow slightly, two men from different cultures finding common ground in sacred objects and shared purpose. Outside, the storm raged on, snow accumulating in drifts that would make tomorrow's travel challenging at best. Jackson added wood to the fire, then settled against his saddle to attempt sleep. His last conscious thought was of Kate somewhere in the darkness below, fighting her own battle while he carried forward the means to end the larger war. "Keep her safe," he whispered the prayer, directed to whatever deity might be listening in this wild, unforgiving land. Morning arrived with deceptive brightness. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world transformed, every surface covered in pristine white that glittered like diamond dust in the early sunlight. The beauty was breathtaking, but treacherous, concealing terrain features that might mean the difference between safe passage and disaster. The Shoshone warriors studied the snow with practiced eyes, assessing its depth and consistency. After a brief conference in their own language, Swift Arrow approached Jackson. "Snow is deep but not too heavy," he reported. "We can travel but slowly. Must watch for hidden dangers." Jackson nodded his understanding. "How far to Fort Bridger from here?" "If no more storms come, we reach there by tomorrow night." They broke camp efficiently, erasing as much evidence of their presence as possible. The horses protested as they were led out into snow that reached their knees in places, but the animals were mountain-bred and soon adjusted to the conditions. Progress was indeed slow. What would have been an easy day's ride in clear weather became an exhausting slog through drifts and over ice-slick rocks. The Shoshone led the way, rotating positions so that no one man bore the brunt of breaking trail for too long. By midday, they had covered perhaps half the distance they would have managed under normal conditions. Swift Arrow called a halt in a small clearing where the snow was less deep, allowing the horses to rest and graze on exposed patches of grass. As they shared a cold meal of jerky and hardtack, High Wolf suddenly stiffened his head, turning toward the back trail like a hound catching a scent. "Riders," he said quietly, "following our tracks." Jackson and the others moved to where High Wolf stood, listening intently. At first, Jackson heard nothing except the soft sigh of wind through snow-laden branches. Then it came to him, the distant but unmistakable sound of horses moving through snow, the occasional clink of metal that might be bridle chains or weapons. "How many?" Jackson asked. High Wolf closed his eyes, concentrating. "4, maybe 5. Moving fast, taking chances in the snow." Swift Arrow nodded grimly. "Hollister's men. They want the papers badly to risk such travel." "Or Walsh's," Jackson added. "Either way, they're gaining on us." A quick conference followed. To continue at their current pace meant eventual overtaking by their pursuers. To increase speed in these conditions invited accidents that could prove fatal. To stand and fight meant potential loss of the documents if they fell in battle. "There is another way," Running Elk suggested, speaking in Shoshone. Swift Arrow translated. "He knows a place ahead. Narrow trail beside deep ravine. Good place for ambush if we reach it first." Jackson considered the option. It meant intentionally engaging their pursuers rather than trying to evade them, a risky strategy, but potentially decisive. "How far?" he asked. 2 hours, maybe less," Swift Arrow replied. "But we must hurry. They gain ground quickly." Decision made, they mounted and pressed forward at the fastest pace safely possible. The horses sensed their riders' urgency and responded gamely, pushing through drifts and navigating icy patches with determined focus. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed higher into the mountains. Pine forest gave way to more open slopes where wind had scoured the snow into fantastical shapes. The air thinned noticeably, making both men and horses labor for breath. Just when Jackson began to wonder if they had somehow missed their destination, Swift Arrow raised a hand and pointed ahead. There the trail narrowed dramatically as it skirted the edge of a precipitous drop. On one side rose a sheer rock face, on the other yawned a ravine several hundred feet deep, its bottom lost in shadow and swirling snow. "There," Swift Arrow said. "Perfect. Perfect place. They must pass single file, no room to maneuver." The Shoshone quickly positioned themselves with practiced efficiency. High Wolf took up position behind a boulder at the near end of the narrow section where he could prevent retreat. Running Elk and Swift Arrow concealed themselves on a small ledge above the middle portion where they would have clear shots at riders below. Jackson was stationed at the far end where he could block forward progress. They settled in to wait, rifles ready, breath-forming clouds in the cold mountain air. Jackson checked the documents inside his coat, ensuring they remained dry and secure. If the ambush failed, if he fell, at least one of the Shoshone might escape with the evidence. He had explained its importance to Swift Arrow, who had memorized the location of the territorial governor's headquarters at Fort Bridger. The waiting was harder than the riding had been. Cold seeped through layers of clothing, numbing fingers and toes. The sun began its westward descent, shadows lengthening across the snow. If their pursuers didn't arrive soon, darkness would complicate the ambush considerably. Then came the sounds they had been expecting, horses approaching, men's voices carried on the wind. Jackson tensed, rifle ready, as the first rider appeared at the entrance to the narrow trail. It was Hollister himself, his shoulder bandaged from Jackson's bullet the day before. Behind him rode four men, all armed, all scanning their surroundings with the wariness of experienced frontiersmen. Yet they entered the narrow section without hesitation, perhaps confident in their superior numbers, or driven by whatever reward Hollister had promised for the document's recovery. Swift Arrow had given clear instructions: wait until all riders were in the confined space before firing. Jackson watched as Hollister advanced, followed by his men in single file. When the last rider entered the narrow section, Swift Arrow gave a bird call signal. The ambush was sprung with devastating effectiveness. High Wolf's first shot took down the rearmost rider, while Swift Arrow and Running Elk fired simultaneously from above their bullets, finding targets with precision born of lifelong practice. Jackson's shot caught Hollister's horse, sending the animal crashing to its knees and throwing its rider against the cliff face. Two of Hollister's men were down immediately, either dead or wounded too severely to fight. A third returned fire, wildly, bullets ricocheting off rock with dangerous unpredictability. The fourth had dismounted and taken cover behind his fallen horse, firing with more discipline at the Shoshone positions above. Jackson focused on Hollister, who had scrambled behind a boulder and was attempting to reload his pistol with his uninjured arm. A careful shot from Jackson sent the weapon spinning from Hollister's hand into the ravine below. "It's over, Hollister," Jackson called. "Surrender, and you might live to stand trial alongside Walsh." Hollister's laugh was bitter. "There won't be any trial. Blackwood Walsh has friends in high places. The governor, the territorial judge, that all have investments in our mining operation. Your evidence will disappear the moment you present it." The claim gave Jackson pause. Could it be true? Was the corruption so widespread that even territorial authorities were complicit? His moment of hesitation nearly proved fatal. One of Hollister's men, previously thought dead, rose up with a final surge of strength and fired. The bullet grazed Jackson's temple, sending him staggering back as blood flowed into his eye. Swift Arrow's return shot ended the threat permanently, but Jackson found himself dangerously close to the ravine edge, snow crumbling beneath his boots. As he struggled to regain his balance, Hollister charged from cover, desperation lending him strength despite his wounded shoulder. He slammed into Jackson with his full weight, driving them both toward the precipice. "If I die, you die with me," Hollister snarled, his face contorted with pain and hatred. "And those papers die too." They grappled at the very edge, boots slipping on snow and ice, the abyss yawning hungrily below. Jackson felt the documents crinkle inside his coat as Hollister's grasping hand sought them. With desperate strength, he twisted, reversing their positions so that Hollister was the one with his back to the drop. "This ends now." Jackson gasped and pushed. Hollister's eyes widened with the sudden realization of his fate. His mouth opened in a scream that echoed up from the ravine as he fell tumbling end over end until darkness swallowed him. Jackson collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily, blood still trickling from the bullet graze. Around him, the brief, violent fight had ended. The Shoshone warriors moved among the fallen enemies, ensuring none still posed a threat. Snow that had been pristine white minutes before was now stained crimson in patches, the stark contrast a visual representation of how quickly violence could transform beauty into horror. Swift Arrow approached, concern evident in his expression as he examined Jackson's wound. "Not deep," he pronounced. "Head wounds bleed much, but heal fast." Jackson nodded, wincing as the movement sent fresh pain lancing through his temple. "Hollister said the governor is involved, that the evidence won't matter." Swift Arrow considered this as he bound Jackson's wound with a strip of clean cloth. "Maybe true, maybe lie from dying man. Either way, we must try. Too many have died already." It was the only path forward, regardless of Hollister's claims. Jackson struggled to his feet, steadied by Swift Arrow's supporting hand. "How far to Fort Bridger now?" he asked. "Half-day's ride tomorrow if we make good camp tonight and start early." Jackson glanced at the bodies scattered across the snow. "And these," Swift Arrow shrugged. "Mountain will take them when spring comes, or wolves before then. They chose this path." There was a certain frontier justice in that assessment. Jackson didn't argue as they collected the dead men's weapons and ammunition, valuable resources in this unforgiving land, before continuing their journey. They made camp that night in another cave smaller than the previous one, but adequate for their needs. Jackson's head throbbed despite the medicine Swift Arrow had applied, and exhaustion weighed on him like a physical burden. Yet sleep proved elusive as his mind churned with questions and concerns. Was Hollister right about the governor's involvement? Would the documents prove worthless if the very authorities they appealed to were complicit in Walsh's schemes? And what of Kate? Had she survived the attack on the trading post? Was she even now wondering if he had succeeded in his mission, or had she already fallen victim to her father's relentless pursuit? The small wooden horse seemed to grow heavier in his pocket, a tangible reminder of all that had been lost and all that might yet be saved. Jackson removed it, turning it over in his hands as firelight played across its simple curves. "We continue at first light," Swift Arrow said, settling beside him. "Better to act than to doubt." Jackson nodded, grateful for the Shoshone's straightforward wisdom. And if Hollister spoke truth about the governor, Swift Arrow was silent for a moment, then responded with the pragmatism that characterized his people's approach to life's challenges. "Then we find another way. There is always another path, even when the first is blocked." With that assurance, meager though it was, Jackson finally surrendered to exhaustion, slipping into a sleep haunted by dreams of falling men and women with birthmarks shaped like stars. Dawn broke clear and cold over the mountain camp. Jackson woke to the scent of coffee, a luxury he hadn't expected in these circumstances. Swift Arrow had traded for a small amount at the last settlement they'd passed, saving it for this final morning of their journey. "For strength," the Shoshone explained, handing Jackson a steaming cup. "Important day." Jackson accepted the offering gratefully. The wound at his temple had scabbed overnight, and though his head still throbbed, his thinking was clear. They would reach Fort Bridger by nightfall, and with it either justice or further betrayal. They broke camp efficiently and set out as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. The snow remained deep in places, but the horses seemed to have found their rhythm in the challenging conditions. The Shoshone led the way as before, their knowledge of the mountain paths proving invaluable as they gradually descended toward the broad valley where Fort Bridger had been established. By midday, they could see the fort in the distance, a collection of log buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade nestled at the junction of two rivers. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance, they could make out the stars and stripes flying above the headquarters building. "Many soldiers," High Wolf observed, pointing to the activity visible around the fort. "More than usual." Swift Arrow nodded. "The governor's visit. They prepare." Jackson studied the scene, calculating their best approach. If Hollister had spoken truth about the governor's involvement in Walsh's schemes, riding directly into the fort with their evidence might be suicidal. Yet what alternative did they have? "We need to determine who can be trusted," Jackson said, thinking aloud. "Not all at the fort would be complicit, even if the governor is." Swift Arrow pointed to a small cluster of lodges set apart from the fort. "Shoshone Camp, Chief Washaki's people. They trade with the fort, but keep their distance. We go there first, learn what we can." The suggestion made sense. Chief Washaki was known as a skilled diplomat who maintained peaceful relations with whites while protecting his people's interests. If anyone could advise them on the political currents at Fort Bridger, it would be he or his counselors. They approached the Shoshone camp cautiously, conscious that even among their own people, Swift Arrow and his companions might not be immediately recognized or welcomed. Relations between different bands of the same tribe could be complex, influenced by territorial considerations and past interactions. Their concerns proved unnecessary. Upon recognizing Swift Arrow's distinctive paint pony and the tribal markings on their clothing, the camp's sentries greeted them with reserved but respectful gestures, escorting them to a large lodge at the center of the encampment. Inside, they found not only several Shoshone elders, but also, to Jackson's surprise, a white man in the uniform of an army major. The officer looked up sharply as they entered, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm before relaxing at the evident respect with which the Shoshone treated the newcomers. "Who's this?" the major asked, his gaze settling on Jackson with particular intensity. Before Jackson could respond, one of the elders spoke in Shoshone. Swift Arrow replied in the same language, a rapid exchange that excluded the white men present. The elder's expression remained impassive, but Jackson noted a subtle shifting among the other Shoshone, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Finally, the elder addressed Jackson directly in accented but clear English. "I am Yellowhawk Counsel to Chief Washaki. These warriors say you carry evidence against Colonel Walsh. Is this true?" Jackson glanced at the major, uncertain whether to speak freely in his presence. Yellowhawk noted his hesitation. "Major Reynolds is not friend to Walsh. You may speak. It's true, Jackson confirmed. Documents proving Walsh has fabricated Apache attacks to justify clearing them from land containing gold deposits, land he and his partner Hollister planned to mine illegally. Major Reynolds straightened his expression, hardening. Serious accusations, Mr. Blackwood. Jackson Blackwood. A flicker of recognition crossed the major's face. The chaplain from Fort Bridger years back. Jackson nodded, surprised to be remembered. You know me. By reputation only, you were gone before I was posted there. Reynolds studied him thoughtfully. These documents, you plan to present them to the governor. That was my intention, until Hollister claimed the governor himself is involved in their scheme. Reynolds and Yellowhawk exchanged glances. Hollister might not have been lying, the major said carefully. Governor Thayer has investment interests in several mining operations. Nothing inherently improper about that, but it does create potential conflicts. Then what's the point? Jackson asked, frustration evident in his voice. If those with authority to act are compromised, where does justice come from? Yellowhawk spoke again. Justice comes from truth spoken so all can hear. Not just governor, but territorial command newspapers, Washington officials. Many ears, not just one. Reynolds nodded. He's right. The governor isn't all-powerful. There's a chain of command, civilian oversight. If the evidence is compelling enough, it won't matter who tries to bury it. He leaned forward. May I see these documents? Jackson hesitated only briefly before removing the packet from inside his coat. He'd come too far, risked too much to hold back now. Either Reynolds was trustworthy or their mission had failed before it truly began. The major examined the papers carefully, his expression growing grimmer with each page he turned. This is comprehensive, he said finally. Orders for attacks that were never officially sanctioned. Falsified reports of Apache raids. Survey maps of gold deposits on protected land. He looked up at Jackson. Where did you get these? From Catherine Walsh, the colonel's daughter. She and her Apache companion gathered them over months before he was killed, and she was captured. She barely escaped with her life. Reynolds' eyebrows rose. Miss Walsh is alive. Last report had her dying of fever at Fort Laramie. A cover story. Walsh couldn't admit his daughter had run off with an Apache scout. When he discovered she was carrying the man's child, he arranged to have her sent east. But his men had other ideas. They tried to hang her as an example. The major's disgust was evident. And now, she was at Gray Fox's trading post last I saw her. Walsh and his men were closing in. I don't know if she... Jackson couldn't finish the sentence. Yellowhawk spoke again to Swift Arrow and Shoshone. The younger man replied at length, gesturing occasionally toward Jackson. Whatever he said caused a murmur among the gathered Shoshone. What is it? Jackson asked. Yellowhawk's dark eyes were unreadable. He says the woman carries a child marked by the spirits, a child who will be bridged between worlds, bearing the sign of the star in moon. Jackson's heart seemed to stop. The birthmark. You know of this sign? My son had the same mark. My wife bore it as a tattoo. Jackson swallowed hard. The father of Catherine's child, an Apache called Running Wolf, had it as well. Silence fell in the lodge as the implications settled over those present. Even Major Reynolds, presumably unfamiliar with the spiritual significance the Shoshone attached to such marks, seemed to sense the weight of the moment. There is more, Yellowhawk continued. Word came yesterday from our brothers to the west, fighting at Gray Fox's trading post. Colonel Walsh and his men attacked but were driven back by Shoshone warriors who arrived to help. Jackson leaned forward eagerly. And the people inside Gray Fox, the women. Gray Fox lives though wounded. His wife fights with the courage of her ancestors. Yellowhawk paused. The white woman was taken. Taken, Jackson's voice cracked. By whom? By her father. When the attack failed, he and two men broke through at night. They took her east toward Fort Laramie. The news hit Jackson like a physical blow. Kate captured and being taken back to the very place she had fled at such cost. Back to her father's control, back to whatever fate he had planned for her and her unborn child. I have to go after her, Jackson said, already rising to his feet. Reynolds held up a hand. Wait, Blackwood. Think. Fort Laramie is 3 days hard ride from here, and that's in good conditions. Walsh has a head start, and once he's back at his command, you won't be able to touch him without these. He tapped the documents. What do you suggest that I abandon her to Walsh while we navigate territorial politics? I suggest we use the system against him, Reynolds replied evenly. The governor arrives tomorrow for the troop review. General Crook comes with him, a man known for his fair treatment of Indians and his intolerance for corruption. We present the evidence to both in public, where it can't be ignored or buried. And if the governor is complicit, as Hollister claimed, then Crook isn't. I know the general. He'll act on evidence this damning regardless of who it implicates. Yellowhawk nodded agreement. The Gray Eagle speaks truth. Better to fight with words and counsel than alone with rifle against many. Jackson paced the confines of the lodge, torn between the desperate need to ride after Kate immediately and the pragmatic recognition that Reynolds' approach offered better odds of success. Every instinct urged him toward Fort Laramie, yet logic argued for patience. One day, he said finally, I'll wait one day for this governor and general. If they don't act immediately, I ride for Fort Laramie alone. Reynolds accepted the compromise with a nod. Fair enough. In the meantime, you should remain here in the Shoshone camp. If Walsh has informants at the fort, your presence might be reported back to him. The major rose to leave the documents secured inside his uniform coat. At Jackson's alarmed expression, he added, I'll keep these safe until tomorrow. You have my word as an officer. After Reynolds departed, Yellowhawk assigned Jackson a small lodge where he could rest and recover from his journey. Swift Arrow and his companions were welcomed among their tribal kin, leaving Jackson momentarily alone with his thoughts and fears. Kate captured again. Being taken back to Fort Laramie, in what condition was she injured? Was the child safe? The questions tormented him as he paced the confines of the small lodge. The wooden horse seemed to weigh heavy in his pocket. He removed it, studying the simple carving in the dim light. If Running Wolf had indeed been Michael, if the child Kate carried was truly his grandchild, then this small toy represented a connection across 3 generations of his family. A family he had thought destroyed, then found in the most unexpected way, only to risk losing again. I'm coming for you, he whispered, as if Kate might somehow hear his promise across the miles that separated them. Hold on, just hold on. Night fell over the Shoshone camp. Jackson forced himself to eat the food brought to him, knowing he would need strength for whatever lay ahead. Sleep, however, proved elusive despite his exhaustion. When it finally came, it brought dreams of hanging ropes and burning villages of birthmarks shaped like stars and children with eyes like Kate's. He woke before dawn, more tired than when he'd lain down. Outside, the camp was already stirring, women tending cooking fires, men preparing for the day's hunting or trading. From the fort came the distant notes of a bugle calling soldiers to their morning duties. Swift Arrow appeared at the lodge entrance bearing a fresh pot of coffee and news. Governor's party arrived in night, he reported. General Crook with him, meeting in headquarters, building at midday. Jackson nodded, accepting a cup of the strong brew. And Major Reynolds. Sent message, all arranged. We go to fort at sunhigh. The hours until midday passed with excruciating slowness. Jackson occupied himself by cleaning his rifle and checking his remaining ammunition preparations that might prove necessary if the meeting with the governor failed to produce results. He would not leave Kate in Walsh's hands regardless of the cost to himself. When the sun reached its zenith, a small delegation from the fort arrived at the Shoshone camp. Major Reynolds and 2 soldiers mounted on army horses. The major dismounted and approached Jackson, who waited with Swift Arrow and Yellowhawk outside the latter's lodge. Governor Thayer and General Crook are ready to receive us, Reynolds announced. I've told them only that we have evidence of serious impropriety involving Colonel Walsh. The details will have more impact coming directly from you, Blackwood. Jackson nodded, mounting the horse provided for him. Yellowhawk and Swift Arrow would accompany them, representing Shoshone interests in the matter. The small procession made its way across the open ground separating the Indian camp from the fort, passing through the main gates under the curious stares of soldiers and civilians alike. The headquarters building stood at the center of the fort, a substantial 2-story structure built of squared logs with a proper shingled roof rather than the sod or thatch common to more temporary buildings. Inside, they were led to a large office where 2 men awaited them. Governor John Thayer was a portly man with the florid complexion of one who enjoyed rich food and strong drink. He wore an expensive suit despite the frontier setting, and his watch chain gleamed gold against his brocade vest. His expression as they entered was one of barely concealed impatience. General George Crook presented a stark contrast, lean and weathered, with a full beard and penetrating eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they fell upon. Though dressed in the formal uniform befitting his rank, he carried himself with the ease of a man accustomed to campaign conditions rather than parade grounds. Major Reynolds, the governor acknowledged with a nod. I understand you have some urgent matter regarding Colonel Walsh. Reynolds deferred to Jackson with a gesture. Mr. Blackwood will explain, sir. He's brought evidence you both should see. Jackson stepped forward, conscious of the importance of these next moments. He had faced combat, survived imprisonment, endured the loss of his family, yet somehow this encounter seemed to carry even greater weight. Governor General, he began, I have documents proving that Colonel Walsh has systematically fabricated reports of Apache hostilities to justify military action against them. His true purpose is to clear them from land containing gold deposits, which he and his business partner, Ezra Hollister, plan to mine illegally. The governor's face darkened. Those are serious accusations, Mr. Blackwood. What evidence supports them? Major Reynolds produced the packet of documents, laying them on the desk. Written orders in Walsh's hand for raids never officially sanctioned. Falsified reports. Survey maps showing gold deposits on protected Apache land. Correspondence between Walsh Hollister and certain mining interests back east. General Crook stepped forward, immediately examining the papers with focused attention. The governor remained seated, his expression guarded. And how did you come by these documents? Thayer asked, making no move to examine them himself. They were collected by Colonel Walsh's daughter, Catherine, and an Apache scout named Running Wolf. After Running Wolf was killed, Miss Walsh fled with the evidence. Walsh's men attempted to hang her as a warning to others. She barely escaped with her life. The governor's eyebrows rose. Catherine Walsh is alive. I was informed she died of fever some weeks ago. Another of her father's, Jackson replied. She survived, but has since been recaptured by Walsh. He's taking her back to Fort Laramie as we speak. General Crook looked up sharply from the documents. Recaptured? What do you mean? Jackson explained the events at Gray Fox's trading post, Walsh's attack, and Kate's subsequent abduction. As he spoke, he watched the reactions of both men carefully. Crook's growing anger was evident in the tightening of his jaw and the narrowing of his eyes. The governor's response was more measured, his expression revealing little beyond professional concern. When Jackson finished his account, silence fell over the room. General Crook returned to the documents, examining them with renewed intensity. Finally, he straightened and turned to the governor. These appear authentic to me, Governor. The signatures match Walsh's. The orders describe operations I never authorized, yet reports of their execution cross my desk. If these are genuine, and I believe they are, we're looking at serious violations of military protocol, treaty obligations, and possibly federal law. Governor Thayer cleared his throat. Even if the documents are authentic, we must consider the possibility that Colonel Walsh was acting under confidential orders from higher authorities. The management of Indian affairs is complex. With respect, Governor, Crook replied coldly, no higher authority authorized attacks on peaceful tribes to secure gold deposits for private interests. That's not complexity, it's criminal. The tension between the two men was palpable. Jackson recalled Hollister's claim about the governor's mining investments and watched Thayer's face carefully for any sign of complicity. What of Catherine Walsh? Jackson interjected. Whatever action you take regarding these documents, she remains in danger. Her father has already tried to eliminate her once. I doubt his intentions are kinder now. General Crook nodded grimly. A valid concern. If these allegations have merit, and I believe they do, then the colonel's daughter requires immediate protection. He turned to Major Reynolds. Prepare a detachment to ride for Fort Laramie at once. 20 men should suffice. For what purpose, General? The governor asked sharply. To place Colonel Walsh under arrest, pending investigation, and to secure the safety of his daughter. Thayer rose from his chair. I must protest. Walsh is a decorated officer with years of distinguished service. To arrest him based on documents of questionable provenance brought by a man with obvious personal grievances. What personal grievances? Crook interrupted. Jackson met the general's questioning gaze steadily. My wife and son died in an Apache village attacked under Walsh's orders 5 years ago. They were there as healers helping with a difficult birth. The village was peaceful with no history of hostility towards settlers. Understanding dawned in Crook's eyes. The Cedar Creek incident. I remember the reports. There were discrepancies that were never satisfactorily explained. Because they were lies, Jackson said simply, just like all the others. The governor's face had grown increasingly flushed during this exchange. General, I must insist that before any action is taken against Colonel Walsh, we consult with the territorial judge, and the Governor Crook cut him off firmly. With all due respect to your office, military discipline falls under my authority. If half of what these documents suggest is true, Walsh has violated his oath military law and basic human decency. I will not delay acting while more innocent lives are lost. He turned to Reynolds. Major, prepare that detachment immediately. Mr. Blackwood will accompany you to Fort Laramie. His knowledge of both the situation and Miss Walsh's condition will be valuable. Reynolds saluted crisply. Yes, sir. We can be ready to ride within the hour. Make it half an hour, Crook amended. Time appears to be of the essence. As Reynolds departed to carry out his orders, the governor made one final attempt to assert control. General, I must formally register my objection to this precipitous action. The territorial administration cannot support. Your objection is noted, Governor. Crook interrupted his tone, leaving no room for further discussion. I suggest you consider your own position carefully. These documents implicate not only Walsh and Hollister, but also certain Eastern investors who may have political connections. It would be unfortunate if those connections were found to extend to territorial officials. The implication was clear. Thayer's face paled slightly before he recovered his composure. I merely advocate for proper procedure, General. Nothing more. Then proper procedure will be followed, Crook assured him. Walsh will be arrested, evidence gathered, and charges formally presented. Justice will be served regardless of where it leads. With that, the meeting effectively concluded. Jackson found himself ushered out by an aide, Yellowhawk, and Swift Arrow following. In the courtyard outside, Swift Arrow spoke quietly. Governor not happy. Has secrets, I think. Jackson nodded. But General Crook seems honest and determined. Good warrior, Yellowhawk agreed. Speaks straight, sees clear. Rare among white chiefs. Major Reynolds joined them minutes later, already issuing orders to gathered soldiers. We ride in 20 minutes, Blackwood. The general wants this handled quickly before Walsh has time to cover his tracks or dispose of inconvenient witnesses. The grim implication sent a chill through Jackson. Kate as an inconvenient witness to her father's crimes, a daughter who had betrayed him by siding with his enemies. What mercy could she expect from such a man? I'll be ready, Jackson assured the major. And Swift Arrow, his knowledge of the country between here and Fort Laramie could prove valuable. Reynolds glanced at the Shoshone warrior, then nodded. If he's willing, I won't refuse the help. Swift Arrow conferred briefly with Yellowhawk before agreeing. I will ride with you. The woman carries a child marked by the spirits. This is now Shoshone business too. Preparations moved with military efficiency. Fresh horses were provided, rations distributed, ammunition issued. Jackson found himself equipped with an Army revolver to supplement his rifle, a Colt 45, that felt both familiar and strange in his hand. How long had it been since he had carried a sidearm? Not since the war, he realized. Another step away from the peaceful life he had tried to build after losing his family. As they prepared to depart, General Crook himself appeared in the courtyard to address the assembled detachment. Men, your mission is clear. Ride to Fort Laramie and place Colonel Von Walsh under arrest. Secure any documents in his possession that may relate to unauthorized operations against Apache settlements. And most importantly, ensure the safety of Catherine Walsh, the colonel's daughter, who may be in grave danger from her own father. The general turned to Jackson. Mr. Blackwood, I've reviewed your military record. Distinguished service as both chaplain and, when circumstances required, combatant. The loss you suffered was a tragedy that should never have occurred. I can't undo that past injustice, but perhaps together we can prevent future ones. Jackson nodded, unexpectedly moved by the general's acknowledgement. Thank you, sir. One more thing, Crook added. I've written to the War Department recommending a formal investigation into all operations against Apache settlements over the past 5 years. It won't bring back those already lost, but it may help establish the truth for history's sake. With a final salute to Major Reynolds, the general stepped back. Reynolds called the order to mount up, and within moments, the detachment was moving out through the fort's main gate, hooves thundering on the packed earth as they set course for Fort Laramie. They rode hard that day, pushing the horses as much as was prudent in the winter conditions. The snow diminished as they descended from the higher elevations, making travel easier but still challenging. By nightfall, they had covered nearly 30 miles, an impressive distance given the circumstances, but far short of the 100 or more that separated them from their destination. Camp was established with military precision, sentries, posted horses, tended fires built. Jackson found himself included in the officers' council as Reynolds planned their approach to Fort Laramie. "Walsh won't surrender quietly," the major observed. "He has too much to lose, and he'll have supporters among his command who either share his views or are ignorant of his true activities." "Surprise is our best advantage," Jackson agreed. "If we can reach the fort before he expects pursuit, we might catch him unprepared." Swift Arrow, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "There is faster way, not for horses, but for 3 or 4 men on foot. Old hunting trail through northern hills. Cuts distance by third." Reynolds looked interested. "Could we reach Fort Laramie ahead of Walsh using this trail?" "Possible," Swift Arrow replied. "He travels with woman, maybe slow. Trail hard, but direct." The major considered this option. A smaller group might succeed where the full detachment would fail. Walsh wouldn't expect just a few men to confront him. "I'll go," Jackson volunteered immediately, "with Swift Arrow to guide us." Reynolds nodded slowly. "I'll accompany you with one of my sergeants. The rest of the detachment can continue on the main route as planned. If we fail, they'll be only a day behind us." The decision made, they selected Sergeant Miller, a veteran scout with experience in difficult terrain, to complete their small party. By dawn, the 4 men were ready to depart, carrying minimal supplies to maximize their speed. The main detachment would continue east along the established trail, maintaining a steady pace that would bring them to Fort Laramie within 3 days. Meanwhile, Jackson's group would attempt the more direct but challenging northern route, hoping to arrive a full day earlier. As they prepared to separate, Jackson found himself oddly reluctant to leave the relative safety of the larger group. Not from fear for himself, but from anxiety about what awaited at their destination. What state would they find Kate in? What reception would they face from Walsh and his men? And most unsettling of all, what if they arrived too late? The wooden horse seemed to burn in his pocket, a talisman of all he had lost and might yet lose again. Jackson touched it briefly for reassurance, then mounted the fresh horse provided for this final leg of their journey. "We ride north until midday," Swift Arrow instructed, already leading the way. "Then west into the hills where the old trail begins." The first hours passed in determined silence, each man focused on the journey and the mission that lay ahead. By midday, as Swift Arrow had predicted, they reached the foothills that marked the beginning of the more difficult terrain. Here they dismounted, concealing their horses in a sheltered ravine where they might be recovered later. "From here we walk," Swift Arrow announced, shouldering his minimal pack. "Trail too narrow, too steep for horses." The path he led them on was indeed challenging, winding through dense pine forest, climbing rocky slopes, descending into hidden valleys that nestled between the hills like secrets kept from the wider world. Without Swift Arrow's guidance, they would have lost their way a dozen times over. They maintained a punishing pace, stopping only briefly for water and to chew on jerky from their packs. By nightfall, Swift Arrow estimated they had covered nearly 20 miles on foot, an impressive distance through such difficult terrain. "Rest now," he advised as they made a cold camp in the shelter of a rocky overhang. "No fire. Walsh might have scouts watching routes from west." The night was bitterly cold, without a fire, but none complained. Each man understood the stakes of their mission. They huddled beneath blankets, taking turns on watch, sleeping fitfully when they could. Dawn found them already moving, muscles protesting, but spirits determined. The terrain grew slightly easier as they descended from the higher elevations, the trail more defined as it wound through valleys and across streams still flowing despite the winter chill. "Fort Laramie," Jackson asked during a brief rest at midday. "Before dark," Swift Arrow confirmed, "if we maintain pace." Reynolds checked his revolver, a habit that spoke of his awareness that they were approaching the most dangerous part of their mission. "Walsh will have returned by now. We need to consider how to approach the fort without being detected." Jackson nodded, mind already working through possibilities. "I know the layout from my time stationed there years ago. There's a service entrance near the stables, usually lightly guarded. If we wait until dusk, we might enter that way with minimal risk." "And once inside," Sergeant Miller asked, "Walsh's quarters will be guarded." We don't need to confront Walsh directly, Reynolds reminded them. Our priority is Miss Walsh's safety. We locate her first, then present our orders to the fort commander. Commander might be loyal to Walsh, Swift Arrow pointed out. Might not recognize your authority. A risk we'll have to take, Reynolds acknowledged, but military discipline is clear. General Crook's orders supersede a colonel's regardless of personal loyalties. They continued their journey with renewed urgency, each step bringing them closer to Fort Laramie and the confrontation that awaited. As the afternoon waned, they caught their first distant glimpse of the fort, a collection of buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade situated at the confluence of the Laramie and North Platte rivers. From their vantage point on a wooded ridge, they studied the fort through Reynolds's field glass. Activity seemed normal: soldiers drilling in the parade ground, wagons coming and going through the main gate, smoke rising from chimneys against the darkening sky. No sign of unusual alert, Reynolds observed. That's in our favor. Walsh's quarters? Jackson asked. Reynolds adjusted the glass. East side of the parade ground, the large building with the veranda. No unusual activity visible. And the stockade, that would be the most likely place for Kate to be held if Walsh considered her a prisoner rather than a daughter. Southwest corner, 2 guards at the entrance. Standard procedure. They watched until dusk began to settle over the valley, then made their way down from the ridge, approaching the fort from the south where the ground offered more cover. As darkness deepened, they reached the outer perimeter, unchallenged. The service entrance near the stables proved to be exactly as Jackson remembered, a small gate used primarily by ostlers and suppliers guarded by a single sentry who appeared more concerned with staying warm than maintaining vigilance. Reynolds approached openly, his uniform visible in the lantern light. Evening, Private, he greeted the startled sentry. Major Reynolds from Fort Bridger on official business. The young soldier snapped to attention. Sir, I wasn't informed of any officers arriving tonight. That's the point of a surprise inspection. Son, Reynolds replied with just the right blend of authority and camaraderie. Now, if you'll let us pass, we have business with your commander. The sentry hesitated only briefly before opening the gate. Yes, sir. Headquarters is, I know my way, Private. Carry on. Once inside, they moved purposefully but without haste, as if they had every right to be there. Soldiers they passed saluted Reynolds automatically, his rank commanding in respect, even if his presence was unexpected. The stockade first, Reynolds decided. If Miss Walsh is being held as a prisoner, that's where we'll find her. They crossed the parade ground, staying to the shadows where possible. The stockade was a solid structure, built of logs with barred windows, and a heavy door guarded as Reynolds had observed by 2 sentries. This time, direct approach would not suffice. These guards would require proper authorization to allow access to prisoners. Diversion, Swift Arrow suggested quietly. Draw guards away, then enter. Reynolds considered this, then nodded to Sergeant Miller. Create a distraction at the barracks, something noisy but not suspicious enough to raise a general alarm. Miller saluted and slipped away into the darkness. Minutes later, shouts erupted from the direction of the barracks, followed by the crash of something heavy falling. The guards at the stockade turned toward the commotion, one stepping away from his post to get a better view. Reynolds seized the moment, approaching the remaining guard with confident authority. Sergeant, what's that disturbance? The guard straightened. Not sure, sir. Sounds like trouble at the barracks. Well, don't just stand there. Go investigate. I'll watch your post until you return. The guard hesitated only briefly before handing Reynolds the keys. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. He hurried off toward the barracks, eager to witness whatever excitement had broken the evening routine. Once he was gone, Reynolds quickly unlocked the stockade door. Hurry, we won't have much time. Inside, they found a row of cells, most empty. A single lantern provided minimal illumination. They moved down the line, checking each cell, finding only 2 occupied, one by a soldier, presumably being disciplined for some infraction, the other by a disheveled civilian who reeked of whiskey. No sign of Kate. She's not here, Jackson said, frustration evident in his voice. Where would Walsh keep her? Reynolds frowned. If not as a prisoner, then perhaps as family under house arrest in his own quarters. They exited the stockade just as the guards were returning, managing to slip away before questions could be asked about their presence. Sergeant Miller rejoined them moments later, slightly breathless. Knocked over a weapons rack, he reported. Blamed it on a stray dog. They bought it, but they're not happy. Swift Arrow, who had remained outside as lookout, pointed toward the eastern side of the fort. Many lights in big house, people moving inside. They made their way cautiously toward Walsh's quarters, the substantial two-story building Reynolds had identified earlier. Unlike the barracks and administrative buildings, this structure had the refinements of a permanent residence. Glass windows, a broad veranda, decorative trim along the eaves. Several windows glowed with lamplight, and as they watched from the shadows of a nearby storehouse, they could see figures moving within. A sentry stood at attention beside the front entrance, not standard procedure for an officer's quarters, Jackson noted. Additional security suggesting something or someone valuable inside Feasting. How do we proceed? Jackson whispered. We can't simply walk in. Reynolds studied the building thoughtfully. No, but I can. As a visiting major, it wouldn't be unusual for me to pay my respects to the fort's commander. While I distract Walsh, you three find a way in through the back and locate Miss Walsh. The plan was risky but offered their best chance. Reynolds straightened his uniform and crossed the open space to the front of Walsh's quarters with confident strides. They watched as he exchanged words with the sentry, who then knocked on the door. Moments later, Reynolds was admitted inside. Now, Swift Arrow urged, already moving toward the rear of the building. Jackson and Miller followed, keeping to the shadows. The back of Walsh's quarters featured a kitchen entrance and several ground-floor windows. One window was partially open despite the evening chill, perhaps to release heat from the cooking fires. Swift Arrow pointed to it, then cupped his hands to give Jackson a boost. The window opened into what appeared to be a pantry, dark and unoccupied. Jackson climbed through silently, then helped Miller follow. Swift Arrow came last, his movements fluid and nearly soundless. They found themselves in the kitchen area, empty except for a pot simmering on the stove. From the front of the house came the murmur of voices. Reynolds and someone else, presumably Walsh, engaged in conversation. A narrow staircase led to the upper floor. Jackson pointed to it, and they ascended carefully, testing each step before committing their weight to avoid creaking boards that might betray their presence. The upper floor was a hallway with several doors leading off it. Light showed beneath one door at the far end, likely Walsh's office or private sitting room, where he was now entertaining Reynolds. The other doors were dark. Jackson tried the nearest door, finding it unlocked. Inside was a small bedroom, empty and unused. The next door revealed a similar scene. The third, however, was locked. He pressed his ear to the wood and heard a soft sound from within, movement, perhaps, or quiet breathing. Jackson gestured to Miller, who produced a small set of picks from his pocket. The lock was simple and yielded quickly to the sergeant's skills. The door swung open to reveal a sparsely furnished bedroom. A single lamp burned low on a side table, illuminating a figure seated in a chair by the window. Kate Walsh turned at their entrance, her eyes widening with a mix of fear and disbelief. Jackson, she whispered, rising unsteadily to her feet. Her face was pale with dark shadows beneath her eyes, but she appeared physically unharmed. The swell of her pregnancy was more pronounced than when he had last seen her. Jackson crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her hands in his. Are you all right? Has he hurt you? Kate shook her head. No, not physically, but he plans to send me east tomorrow to an asylum where they'll take my child, and she couldn't finish the sentence. That won't happen, Jackson assured her. We're here to take you to safety. General Crook himself has ordered your father's arrest. Hope flickered in Kate's eyes. The documents, did you deliver them? Yes, the general believes them authentic. That's why we're here. Jackson turned to Miller. We need to move quickly before Reynolds runs out of conversation. Miller nodded, already checking the hallway. Clear for now, but getting out won't be as easy as getting in. Swift Arrow, who had remained by the door, suddenly tensed. Someone coming, he warned, melting back into the shadows of the room. They heard footsteps on the stairs, then in the hallway, too heavy to be Reynolds. The door to Kate's room was still ajar from their entry. Jackson pulled Kate behind him as a figure appeared in the doorway. Colonel Harrison Walsh filled the frame, his imposing height accentuated by the formal uniform he wore even in his own home. His cold gaze took in the scene with methodical precision. His daughter, the 3 intruders, the obvious rescue attempt in progress. Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice controlled despite the situation. I wondered if you might attempt something this foolish. His hand moved to the revolver at his hip. Step away from my daughter. Jackson remained where he was, shielding Kate with his body. It's over, Walsh. General Crook has the documents. He's ordered your arrest for fabricating attacks on peaceful Apache settlements, among other charges. A flicker of something concerned anger crossed Walsh's features before his composure returned. Documents can be questioned, witnesses discredited, especially witnesses with personal vendettas against the accused. Not this time, Jackson replied. Too many pieces fit together, too many inconsistencies in your reports. The general has already written to the War Department recommending a full investigation. Walsh's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And you believe that will bring justice for your wife, your son. How naive, Chaplain. The wheels of military bureaucracy grind exceeding slow and often in directions influenced by political expedience rather than truth. Perhaps, Jackson acknowledged, but in the meantime, Kate comes with us. Whatever happens with the investigation, she won't remain in your control. Walsh's laugh was cold. And where will you take her back to your mountain cabin to play house with a woman half your age, a woman carrying a half-breed child that will be shunned by both worlds? His gaze shifted to Kate. Is that the future you want Catherine to be the mountain man's consolation prize? Kate stepped from behind Jackson, facing her father directly. Better that than to be your prisoner. Better to be free among those who accept me than caged by those who claim to love me while controlling every aspect of my life. You're confused, Walsh replied, his tone softening to one of paternal concern that rang false to Jackson's ears. Traumatized by your experiences. That savage filled your head with romantic notions that have no place in reality. That savage, Kate said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes, was more civilized than you could ever hope to be. He lived with honor without deceit. Can you say the same, Father? Walsh's expression hardened. Honor. There's no honor in betraying one's own kind, in lying with the enemy, in bearing his child. His hand tightened on his revolver. Step aside, Blackwood. My daughter needs help, not rescue. The arrangements I've made are for her own good. Jackson remained immovable. The arrangements you've made are to hide your shame and protect your schemes. Kate stays with us. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for Swift Arrow's silent intervention. While attention had been focused on the confrontation between Jackson and Walsh, the Shoshone warrior had circled behind the colonel. Now with movements too swift to counter, he pressed a knife against Walsh's back. Drop gun, Swift Arrow commanded quietly, or join ancestors sooner than planned. Walsh froze, then slowly released his grip on the revolver, allowing it to slide back into its holster. You won't escape the fort, he said, his voice level despite his precarious position. My men are loyal. They'll stop you at the gates. Perhaps, came Major Reynolds' voice from the hallway, but they'll have to disobey direct orders from General Crook to do so. He stepped into view with his own revolver drawn. Colonel Harrison Walsh, by order of General George Crook, I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy, falsification of military reports, and violations of treaty obligations with sovereign Apache tribes. Walsh's face darkened with fury. This is absurd. You have no authority here, Reynolds. This is my command. Was your command, Reynolds corrected. As of this moment, you are relieved of duty pending investigation. Captain Hendricks has been informed and has acknowledged General Crook's orders. He produced a folded document bearing an official seal. Your formal arrest order, Colonel. I suggest you come quietly, for your daughter's sake, if nothing else. For a moment, it seemed Walsh might resist despite the odds against him. Then, with visible effort, he controlled himself. This isn't over, he said, his gaze fixed on Jackson. Documents can be lost, witnesses can disappear, and daughters, his eyes shifted to Kate, can reconsider their loyalties when faced with the harsh realities of the world. That's enough, Colonel, Reynolds said firmly. Agent Miller, secure the prisoner. As Miller moved to handcuff Walsh, Kate stepped forward, facing her father one last time. I want you to know something, she said quietly. Running Wolf, the man you called a savage, the man you had killed, he was more than just someone I loved. He was the son of the man standing beside me. Walsh's expression showed confusion, then disbelief. What nonsense is this? Michael Blackwood didn't die in that village 5 years ago, Kate continued. Elizabeth entrusted him to an Apache family before returning to help others. He grew up as Running Wolf, never knowing his true origins until he began searching for clues to his past. The birthmark he carried, the crescent moon and star, was proof of his lineage. She placed a hand on her swollen belly. This child carries the blood of both our families, Father. Your grandchild will be born with the same mark, a bridge between worlds you tried so hard to keep apart. Walsh stared at her, then at Jackson's shock momentarily replacing his anger. Impossible, he whispered, but doubt had crept into his voice. You're lying to torment me. I have no need to lie, Kate replied. The truth is torment enough. As Miller led Walsh away, the colonel's composure finally cracked. Catherine, he called back, don't do this. You're a Walsh. You belong with your own kind. Kate watched him go, her expression a complex mix of sorrow, relief, and resolve. When he was gone, she turned to Jackson, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. It's really over, she asked. Jackson nodded, taking her hands gently in his. It's over. You're safe now. Reynolds approached, holstering his revolver. We should move quickly. Walsh's most loyal men might still attempt to interfere despite Captain Hendricks's caution. Cooperation. They made their way downstairs and out through the kitchen door, avoiding the front entrance where curious soldiers had begun to gather at the news of their colonel's arrest. Swift Arrow led them toward the service gate where they had entered, moving with the purposeful stride of those on official business rather than the furtive movements of escapees. The young sentry who had admitted them earlier looked confused at their reappearance, especially with Kate among them. But Reynolds' authoritative manner prevented questions. Within minutes they were outside the fort, making their way toward the sheltered ravine where Swift Arrow had suggested they regroup before determining their next moves. Only when they were safely beyond immediate pursuit did Kate allow herself to truly react to the night's events. Her composure, maintained so admirably throughout the confrontation with her father, finally gave way to the emotional and physical strain of all she had endured. Jackson caught her as her knees buckled, lifting her easily into his arms, as he had on that stormy night when she first appeared at his cabin door. So much had happened since then, so much revealed, lost, and found again. Rest now, he murmured, as she leaned against his shoulder. You're safe. The child is safe. That's all that matters. Kate's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own. Not all, she whispered. There's also tomorrow, and all the days after. Days we'll face together if you're willing. Jackson looked down at her face, pale in the moonlight, but filled with a strength that surpassed mere endurance. In her eyes, he saw not just the woman she was, but the family they might become, she himself and the child who carried the blood of both their lines. I'm willing, he replied softly. More than willing. The wooden horse seemed lighter in his pocket now, no longer a burden of memory, but a bridge between past and future. Whatever challenges awaited them, and there would be many in a world that looked askance at unions like theirs, they would face them together, healing each other's scars with the balm of shared understanding and newfound hope. In the distance, Fort Laramie's lights glowed against the night sky, a reminder of the civilization they had both fled in different ways. Before them stretched the wilderness, harsh but honest, demanding but fair in its demands. Jackson adjusted Kate in his arms and turned westward toward the mountains that had once been his refuge and would now become their home. Behind them, justice was beginning its slow but inexorable work. Ahead lay a future neither of them could have imagined in their darkest hours. Home, Kate murmured, already half asleep against his chest. Home, Bayam. Jackson agreed, the word carrying a warmth it had lacked for 5 long years. They moved forward into the night, two souls scarred by the same forces, now bound by something stronger than the wounds that had marked them. A love born not of convenience or passion alone, but of recognition of finding in each other the missing pieces of their broken worlds. Above them, stars wheeled in ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering, yet somehow bearing witness to human resilience. Among them, perhaps the spirits of those they had lost. Elizabeth, the original Michael Running Wolf, who was also Michael, watched over their journey toward healing and the new life that would carry forward their shared legacy. The mountains waited silent and eternal, offering not escape but perspective, a reminder that even the deepest scars fade with time, becoming part of the landscape rather than defining it. And in that knowledge lay the beginning of peace.